Imagine, if you will, a Europe cloaked not only in the mists of its northern forests, but also in a silence that history itself seems reluctant to break. The age we call dark was not only an age of dimming light, but also of secrets left unspoken, of veils carefully drawn across the memory of entire dynasties. Among these shadows lingers the whisper of a family whose blood was said to shimmer with mystery, neither wholly mortal nor wholly divine. They were the Merovingians, rulers of the Franks, kings whose legend hums like a buried chord beneath the soil of France. The chronicles tell us little, and yet their silences speak louder than words. Why? In the heart of Europe's formative centuries, does the story of this royal line flicker so strangely, as if someone had pressed a finger across the page to smudge the ink? There are glimpses, long-haired kings with mystical powers, queens whose names blend with ancient goddess myths, battles fought not merely with swords, but with symbols. And then, as suddenly as they rise, they vanish into obscurity, replaced by others, their memory reduced to fragments. Picture the early dawn of medieval Europe, stone churches newly rising against the schism, incense curling in the air, monks bent over parchment by candlelight. Outside, the forests stretch, deep and untamed, where wolves still move at the edges of villages, and rivers run like silver arteries through the land. Somewhere in these landscapes, a dynasty built its claim to rule not by armies of men, but by something more elusive, an aura of sanctity, of otherness. Their kings were called the long-haired ones, for to cut their locks was to strip away their right to reign. Was this only ritual, or did the hair itself signify a bloodline believed untouchable? Legends murmur of hidden unions, of royal daughters joined to ancient priests, of secret guardianship of relics thought lost. Some would later whisper that the Merovingians carried not merely noble blood, but something far more precious, something intertwined with the very roots of Christian myth. Could this be why their story was so carefully folded into silence, erased from plain view, but never entirely extinguished? Consider how history is often written by victors, by those who wish to cast light only on their chosen heroes. What if the Merovingians carried a truth so unsettling, so dangerous to the powers that came after them, that their memory had to be veiled? Was it only political convenience that ended their dynasty, or was it part of a greater concealment, a deliberate covering up of something that might change the way we see the entire Dark Ages? The air grows thick with the incense of mystery. Imagine yourself walking through the ruins of an old Frankish church, where broken stones still bear the faint carving of a cross, where moss creeps over forgotten crypts. In the silence, you wonder what secrets lie beneath these stones, what names have been deliberately chiseled out, what relics buried, what truths whispered only from one guardian to the next. This is not just a story of kings and queens, but of something older, stranger, an inheritance of legend woven into blood. To speak of the Merovingians is to touch the edge of a tapestry where history and myth entwine so tightly that one cannot say where fact ends and imagination begins. Were they saints or sorcerers, chosen by heaven or cursed by heaven's rivals? Perhaps they were simply human rulers, yet clothed in myths that later centuries could not allow to remain. Or perhaps they were more. Tonight, we draw near to that veil, not to tear it open, but to listen to the whispers that drift from behind it, whispers of power, of betrayal, of secrets sealed in stone and sealed in blood, whispers that reach across centuries, still unsettled, still echoing, still waiting. And so, the question rises gently like smoke into the night. What was the true secret of the Merovingians, and why did history feel compelled to hide it away? The path lies before us, winding, dim, but strangely luminous at its edges. Let us take the first step into the darkened forests and river valleys of ancient Gaul, where the land itself remembers what the chronicles have forgotten. There, in the very soil and stones, the Merovingian mystery begins to breathe again, awaiting those willing to listen to the silence. Close your eyes and allow yourself to drift backward through time. The world grows dim, and when the veil lifts again, you find yourself standing in the landscape of 6th century Gaul. The Roman Empire has crumbled, leaving behind scattered stones and half-forgotten roads, and the land itself seems suspended between two worlds, one fading, the other still undefined. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth, of wood smoke curling upward from village hearths, of pine needles trodden beneath the hooves of wandering cattle. Great forests stretch like endless oceans of green, so dense that sunlight breaks through only in trembling patches. Wolves haunt the edges of settlements, their eyes glinting with a cold light, while bears still prowl the deeper wilderness. The river's mighty arteries like the Seine, the Loire, and the Rhine carry the songs of ancient peoples, their currents glimmering in the moonlight like polished metal. This was Gaul, a land that once bent beneath the might of Rome, its towns echoing with Latin voices, its fields tilled under the eagle's shadow. But Rome has retreated, its marble forums falling to ruin, its statues toppled or buried. The aqueducts crumble in silence, vines crawling over arches once proud and triumphant. In their place, something raw and untamed has returned, the murmur of sacred groves, the drumbeat of tribal gatherings, the whispered prayers to saints whose names mingle uneasily with older gods. The people themselves live in a fragile balance between past and future. Some still cling to fragments of Roman order bishops writing letters in fine Latin, clerks struggling to maintain laws on fading parchment. Others embrace the rhythms of the earth, gathering in thatched villages, ruled not by emperors, but by chiefs who measure power in cattle, land, and warriors. At the crossroads of these worlds stands the Frankish kingdom, rising like a new constellation from the twilight of empire. It is here, in this liminal land, that the Merovingians take root. Their story belongs to Gaul's soil as much as to its people. To understand them, one must see the landscapes they walked, breathe the air that carried their prayers and their secrets. Picture a Merovingian court, perhaps not yet the gleaming palaces of later kings, but wooden halls, dark and smoky, hung with shields and banners. Warriors sit around long tables, drinking mead from horn cups, their long hair flowing like river water over their shoulders, each lock said to carry something of their authority. Step outside those halls, and the night deepens. Stars shine with a brilliance unknown to modern eyes, for there are no cities to drown their light. In the stillness, one hears the creak of ox carts, the distant chant of monks in stone chapels, the cries of owls circling above ancient burial mounds. The land itself seems to hold memory fields still haunted by Roman legions, forests where druids once lit sacred fires, riverbanks where strange offerings lie buried beneath the mud. The geography of this world is more than backdrop. It is a living presence. The Franks inhabit the lands north of the Loire, stretching toward the Rhine, and their kings hold sway from the lowlands of Belgium to the edges of Burgundy. To the west, the wild coasts of Brittany whisper with Celtic songs, while in the south, vineyards cling to the hillsides where Roman villas once gleamed white in the sun. Beyond the Alps lies Italy, fractured and contested, where Rome's memory still lingers like perfume after the wearer has gone. And farther east, the shadow of Byzantium looms, its emperors watching Europe with wary eyes. But Gaul, this fractured heart of Europe, is where the Merovingians weave their mystery. Here, politics is inseparable from landscape, for power is measured not only in swords, but in sacred places. A king must be crowned at a certain river, or ride to battle carrying relics from a saint's tomb. He must touch the soil where his ancestors lie, or draw strength from the strange murmuring springs that locals still call holy. There is something almost dreamlike in the blending of Christian faith with older reverence for the land. A traveler wandering through Merovingian Gaul might pass from a cathedral where incense curls beneath painted ceilings to a nearby grove where villagers still leave bread or milk at the foot of an ancient oak. The church itself grows in power, yet it adapts to the rhythms of the land, baptizing sacred springs as holy wells, naming old gods as saints, weaving fragments of myth into the fabric of faith. Within this setting, the Merovingian kings walk like figures of legend. They are called Reges Creniti, the long-haired kings. Their flowing locks are not vanity, but symbol as vital to their identity as crown or sword. To cut their hair is to strip them of kingship, to reduce them to nothing more than mortal men. Why hair? One wonders, perhaps it is a relic of older traditions, when strength was believed to dwell in locks, as in the tale of Samson. Perhaps it is something deeper still, a sign of a bloodline that claims to be set apart, carrying power invisible yet undeniable. Imagine one such king riding along the banks of the Rhine. His cloak is of deep crimson, his hair a golden river down his back. Around him, the banners of his household knights snap in the wind, painted with strange symbols, crosses, interlaced with ancient motifs, as though two worlds are joined in one. Behind him march priests, chanting psalms, carrying reliquaries that gleam with jewels. Yet among the soldiers are men who whisper older prayers, who trace runes on their swords before battle. This is the paradox of Merovingian Gaul, Christian and pagan, civilized and wild, memory and mystery entwined. The historical stage itself heightens the sense of secrecy. After Rome's collapse, Europe is a mosaic of kingdom, alliances shifting like shadow. The Visigoths rule in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, while the Saxons carve out their place in the north. The Franks, under Merovingian rule, stand at the threshold of greatness, destined to shape the map of Europe for centuries. And yet, even as they rise, their memory will later dim, eclipsed by successors who claim their mantle but deny their legacy. For now, though, in these centuries of twilight, their presence is undeniable. In Metz, Paris, Soissons, and Reims, their courts flicker with both grandeur and danger. In monasteries, scribes record fragments of their deeds, though much will be lost. The scent of parchment, the scratch of quills, the glow of oil lamps, all of it conspires to preserve pieces of a story that will later be shrouded. And beneath it all lies the land Gaul itself, breathing like a living witness. Its hills, its rivers, its forests carry echoes of the Merovingians, echoes that have not faded even now. Stand among the ruins of an old Merovingian church, and you may feel it still a hush in the air, as though the stones themselves remember something unsaid. It is in this world, half memory, half myth, that the Merovingians emerge, not merely kings, but symbols woven into the very geography of Europe. Their dynasty begins as the land itself begins to shift, as old gods fall silent and new faith takes root, as history itself pauses, uncertain, before stepping into what we call the Middle Ages. And so, the stage is set, forests whispering, rivers gleaming, churches rising, and in their midst a family whose bloodline carries rumors of sanctity, mystery, and something more than human. From this soil of Gaul, the Merovingians will rise strange, luminous, and fated to be remembered as much for what was hidden as for what was told. Their story begins here, in the geography of twilight. Soon, we will turn from the land to the figures themselves, to the kings and queens whose shadows stretch across the centuries. Who were they? What was their secret? And why? Even now, does their name stir something half forgotten in the collective memory of Europe? The veil shimmers, and we step closer, ready to meet the guardians of this mystery, the Merovingians themselves, in the dim corridors of early medieval memory. When Europe still stirred restlessly from the collapse of Rome, there emerges a figure half shrouded in history, half cloaked in legend. His name is Childeric, the first of the Merovingian kings whose story history deigns to tell. Yet even here, in the account of this progenitor, the line between truth and myth is as blurred as candlelight seen through smoke. Was he a mere chieftain, a warrior of blood and iron, or was he already something more, a man marked by destiny, bearing within him the spark of a mystery that later centuries would struggle to name? Let us step closer to his shadow. It is the mid-5th century, and Gaul is fractured. The Romans, once masters, cling feebly to their cities, meanwhile Franks, Saxons, and Burgundians jostle for power. Among the Franks rises Childeric, a king said to have been both feared and revered. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover his grave at Tournai, where golden bees, delicate, shimmering, almost otherworldly, lay buried with him. Were they mere ornaments, or did they signify something stranger? Napoleon himself, upon seeing them, would adopt the bee as his emblem, believing he had touched a relic of ancient royalty. It is no coincidence that bees hum around the beginnings of the Merovingian mystery, for in the ancient world, bees were sacred symbols of immortality, of divine order, of a life that persists beyond death. The Egyptians linked them to the soul, the Greeks to prophecy and sacred honey, and here, in a Frankish grave, they gleam again, as if whispering that the Merovingians were not simply kings of men, but guardians of something far older. From Childeric flows the line that would shape the destiny of Gaul. His son, Clovis, looms large as central not only to the Merovingian dynasty, but to the very foundation of medieval France. He is remembered as a warlord, fierce and ambitious, who carved out an empire with his sword. Yet he is also remembered for something stranger, a sudden, almost mystical conversion to Christianity, a turning of his heart after victory in battle, guided by the prayers of his wife, Clotilde. It is said that before his baptism, Clovis called upon the Christian God in desperation, "Grant me this victory." He is imagined to have whispered beneath his breath, "And I shall believe." When he triumphed, he kept his vow, and in the cathedral of Rheims, he bowed his head beneath holy waters. Around him, 3,000 warriors followed, baptized in a single day, the river of their old faiths folding suddenly into a Christian tide. And yet, what lies beneath this moment? Was it purely politics, the binding of Frankish swords to the growing power of the church? Or was it a deeper fusion, a marriage of sacred blood with sacred right? Some whisper that Clovis did not abandon his mysteries, but cloaked them beneath a Christian veil, carrying into the church something older, something unspoken. As Clovis reigned, the Merovingians began to embody an aura beyond mere kingship. They were not like other rulers. Chroniclers called them the Reges Creniti, the long-haired kings. Their flowing hair was more than fashion, it was essence. To cut it was to disinherit them, to strip them of their very identity. Warriors would sooner die than see their king shorn, for a Merovingian without his hair was no king at all. It was a strange taboo, rooted perhaps in pagan lore, in the belief that strength and spirit flowed through unbroken locks, but it also spoke of bloodline, a sign that they were set apart, untouchable, almost sacred. This symbolism made them figures both revered and feared. Imagine a Merovingian king seated upon his throne in Soissons or Metz, his hair glistening in torchlight, his eyes fixed with a steady calm. Before him kneel warriors, priests, emissaries. His authority radiates not from crown alone, but from something subtler in aura, a sense that he stands at the threshold of the mortal and the divine. He is not just a ruler, but a vessel. Some whispered he could heal with a touch, that his presence calmed storms, that his blood itself bore an unearthly mark. The dynasty itself became a kind of organism, larger than any one king. Queens such as Clotilde and Brunhild wielded immense influence, weaving webs of alliance and intrigue. Bishops courted their favor. Monasteries rose under their patronage. Yet behind the pomp, something restless stirred rumors that the Merovingians kept secrets, that their blood was guarded like a relic, that their lineage was bound to mysteries far older than Gaul itself. To speak of the Merovingians is to step into a labyrinth of associations. Their name is tied to Merovec, the semi-legendary ancestor from whom they claim descent. Here the tale grows strange, for Merovec, it was said, was born of a queen who encountered a creature from the sea. Some called it a beast, others a spirit. From this union came the bloodline that bore the dynasty's name. Was this tale mere invention, or did it preserve a memory of something sacred and unsettling, a hybrid origin, neither wholly of man nor wholly of nature, but something liminal, dwelling between worlds? This origin myth would echo down the centuries, for it suggested that the Merovingians were not merely kings, but bearers of a secret inheritance. Their blood was not only noble, it was different, and in this difference lay both their strength and their doom. Within their courts, this aura shaped ritual and power. When a Merovingian king presided over councils, his long hair shimmering in the light, he was not simply a monarch, but a living symbol of continuity. Even when real power began to pass into the hands of others, the mayors of the palace, the aristocrats who wielded armies, the kings themselves retained their mystique. They became figureheads, but figureheads infused with sacred presence, as if their very existence maintained a fragile balance in the kingdom. We see, then, that the Merovingians as an organization were not merely political rulers, they were something closer to a sacred dynasty. Their kingship combined the charisma of ancient chieftains with the sanctity of saints. their queens often embodying both political cunning and archetypal power. To look upon them was to look upon an inheritance that carried both blessing and danger. Yet, even in their prime, shadows gathered around them. Chroniclers often wrote with a strange tone, half admiring, half dismissive, as if struggling to reconcile what they saw with what they were allowed to say. For the Merovingians did not fit neatly into the categories of Christian Europe. They carried too much of the old world, too much of something untamed. Their long hair, their semi divine ancestry, their relic guarding courts all suggested a dynasty that had never fully surrendered to the church's narrative. They cooperated, they baptized, but they remained different. Perhaps this is why their legacy would later be obscured, their memory covered like a fire smothered under ash. But for now, in these centuries, they stand luminous kings of both history and legend, figures around whom mysteries swirl. Smewel. Picture one of their councils. A bishop speaks of Christ, raising his hand in blessing. A warrior boasts of victory, laying his sword upon the table. A queen listens, her eyes sharp with calculation. And above them all, the Merovingian king sits silent, his hair gleaming, his presence an unspoken reminder. Here is a dynasty not hot holy of this world. The organization of their rule was fragile yet potent, kingdoms divided among sons, rejoined by conquest, near fractured again, like rivers branching and merging. Blood feuds flared, queens clashed with nobles, monasteries rose and fell in their favor. And yet through it all, the dynasty endured, its name carrying an aura beyond mere politics. It was as though the Merovingians ruled not only by sword and law, but by something subtler, myth itself. And that myth would not die easily. It lingers even now, whispering from the pages of old chronicles, from the gleam of golden bees in a Tournai grave, from the hush of ruined churches where their kings once prayed. It lingers because it was never only about them, it was about what they symbolized: a bloodline, a secret, a mystery that Europe was not yet ready to name. The Merovingians stand, then, at the center of our tale, not merely characters, but a dynasty that was both fact and fable, history and myth. Their kings walked the earth, but their shadow touched something beyond. To understand them is to step into a labyrinth, where every corridor leads deeper into the question: what was their secret, and why was it hidden? From here, the path winds backward to origins more ancient than Childeric's bees or Clovis's baptism. We must now listen to the legends, the whispers of seaborne ancestry, of sacred unions, of tales half pagan, half Christian. For the Merovingians do not begin in history alone. They begin in legend. Every dynasty, if one listens closely enough, carries with it not only the facts of its rise, but also the whispers of its beginnings, whispers so strange that they slip beyond history into the realm of myth. For the Merovingians, those whispers coalesce around a figure half seen in the twilight of memory: Merovec. His name clings to the dynasty like morning mist to the grass, and yet his story is anything but simple, for it was said that Merovec was born not wholly of man, but of a union that even now unsettles the imagination. The tale is told in fragments, scattered across chronicles and retellings. A Frankish queen, so the story goes, wandered to the edge of the sea. There, she encountered a creature, some say a great fish, others a sea beast, and still others something far stranger, shimmering between forms. It drew near, and from that encounter she conceived. The child born of this union was Merovec, a boy destined to give his name to a dynasty that would reign for centuries. Was this tale meant as metaphor, or was it a memory of something deeper, stranger in the ancient world? The sea was a place of mystery, of gods and monsters, of thresholds between worlds. The Greeks spoke of Triton and Poseidon, the Celts of water spirits and Selkies, the Norse of beings that swam beneath the waves with faces both human and inhuman. To say a child was born of the sea was to place him outside ordinary lineage, to mark him as one touched by the other. The Frankish people accepted this story not as mockery, but as truth. For them, a king was never merely a man. He was a vessel of forces older than law, a mediator between earth and spirit. The Merovingians, through Merovac, bore the mark of such a destiny. Their long hair, their strange symbols, their aura of sanctity, perhaps all of it was traced back to that moment when a queen met the sea. And yet, Christianity, newly spreading across Gaul, looked upon such tales with unease. How could kings claim legitimacy through a union with a sea beast? And so, the story was half hidden, half allowed, its strangeness dulled but never erased. Monks recorded it in cryptic language, neither denying nor fully affirming, as though unsure whether they transcribed history or heresy. It lingers in the margins, a tale too stubborn to die. But the sea birth was not the only whisper surrounding the Merovingians. Legends wove around them like ivy, rooted in both pagan memory and Christian reinterpretation. Some said they descended from Trojan refugees, kin to the very founders of Rome. Others claimed their bloodline carried traces of sacred guardianship, as if their veins held mysteries too dangerous to name. The golden bees found in Childeric's grave, for instance, were they mere ornaments or echoes of a symbol carried from ancient Egypt, where bees were linked to the soul and to Osiris himself? Could it be that the Merovingians drew upon symbols older than Gaul, older than Europe itself? Consider the forests of Gaul, where druids once moved in silence beneath oaks, and rivers where offerings of gold and weapons were thrown into the depths. The Merovingians ruled these lands, and in their aura, one senses the residue of those rituals. It is possible that their myths were not inventions, but survivals, echoes of an older sacred kingship, reshaped to fit a Christian age. The sea beast, the bees, the long hair all may have been signs that the Merovingians were heirs not only to Roman lands, but to the spiritual inheritance of the pagan past. And then there are the Christian legends, which weave into the Merovingian story with curious insistence. Some whispered that the dynasty carried not only pagan mystery, but also a connection to the holiest of Christian bloodlines. Later centuries, especially in the medieval imagination, would suggest that the Merovingians were guardians of a secret, perhaps even the descendants of Christ himself, through a hidden lineage preserved in silence. This idea, though speculative and controversial, grew roots in the imagination of Europe, nurtured by mystery and the absence of definitive denial. Why did such stories persist? Perhaps because the Merovingians themselves invited them. A king crowned not only by warriors, but also by myth is harder to overthrow. By claiming a lineage from the sea, from sacred symbols, from echoes of Christ, the dynasty surrounded itself with an aura that mere politics could never grant. They became more than rulers, they became vessels of mystery. Imagine standing in a Merovingian court during these early centuries. Around you, warriors drink from horns, bishops chant Latin prayers, and yet there, at the center, sits the king. His hair is long and shining, untouched by blade. His presence radiates something beyond mere authority. Behind him, on a tapestry, bees and fish are woven into intricate patterns, symbols of his lineage. A queen sits beside him, her eyes sharp with knowledge of both scripture and sorcery, her influence as potent as his. And in the silence of the hall, you sense it this dynasty is not like others. It is wrapped in a cloak of legend, half light, half shadow. It is also worth remembering that myths are never just myths, they serve purposes. To say Merovec was born of the sea was to declare that the Merovingians were chosen, set apart, beyond the reach of ordinary laws. To weave bees into their burials was to speak of rebirth, immortality, divine order. To let whispers of holy bloodlines circulate was to root their dynasty in a story too dangerous to challenge. Yet myth is also fragile. The same strangeness that gave the Merovingians their aura also made them suspect. To some, their long hair, their odd symbols, their sea-born origin made them seem too pagan, too strange for a Christian age. Their difference was both their crown and their doom. For a time, it lifted them above rivals, cloaking them in awe. But in the centuries to come, it would also provide an excuse to cast them aside, their aura rebranded as dangerous, unholy, unfit for the new order of Europe. Still, their legends did not vanish. They lingered, humming beneath the surface of history. Monks might downplay them, chroniclers might frown, but the people remembered. In whispered tales told by hearth fire, in symbols carved on stone, in bees unearthed from graves, the Merovingian myth survived. And so, when we look back now, What we see is not a dynasty of simple kings and warriors. We see a dynasty born of mystery, clothed in symbols and haunted by legends of origins too strange to dismiss. The story of Merovec, the sea-born child, may never be proven, but perhaps that is not the point. Perhaps the point is that the Merovingians themselves wanted us to wonder, to never quite separate history from myth. For in that uncertainty lies their power, the ability to live on, not just as rulers of a forgotten age, but as shadows that still stir the imagination. And so, as we leave these ancient origins, the question deepens: how did such a dynasty, marked by legend, move from myth into power? What steps carried them from seaborne whispers and sacred symbols to thrones, crowns, and empires? The answer awaits in the next stage of their story, the rise of the Merovingians. When legend took on flesh and marched across the battlefields of Europe, the Merovingian mystery, born of seafoam legends and shimmering symbols, did not remain in the realm of whispers. It became flesh, iron, and blood upon the battlefields of early medieval Europe. If their origins were myth, their rise to power was the slow unfurling of destiny, like a banner caught by the wind, first trembling, then rippling, then commanding the sky. Let us return to the middle of the 5th century, when Gaul trembled beneath the aftershocks of Rome's fall. Across its rivers and plain, the vacuum left by the eagles of the empire invited both chaos and opportunity. The Visigoths pressed from the south, the Burgundians from the east, the Saxons from the northern coasts. Roman generals, clinging to their last provinces, struggled to martial authority. And amid this fractured world, the Franks, once fragmented tribes scattered along the Rhine, began to coalesce. It was under Childeric that the first seeds of Merovingian power were planted, a man both feared and enigmatic. Childeric is remembered less for his deeds than for the legacy of his burial. His grave at Tournai, uncovered centuries later, gleamed with golden bees, a sword inlaid with garnets, a signet ring inscribed with his name. These were not the trappings of a mere tribal chieftain, they were symbols of a ruler who already understood the power of image, mystery, and the intertwining of myth with kingship. From Childeric, the mantle passed to his son, Clovis. With Clovis, the Merovingian legend strode fully into history. Clovis was a warrior of rare ferocity, a man who bore the hunger of conquest in his eyes. He knew instinctively that in a world torn by rivalries, only boldness could carve a kingdom from the bones of Rome. Sword in hand, he began to gather the fractious Frankish clans, binding them with both loyalty and fear. One can picture him on the eve of battle, his long hair flowing, his warriors gathered in smoky tents, the air thick with the scent of leather, steel, and wood smoke. Outside, the river murmurs, carrying reflections of star. Within, Clovis speaks in a voice both commanding and cold, a promise of plunder, a vow of blood, a reminder that the Merovingian destiny was not to linger in shadow, but to rule. His men believed him not merely because he was strong, but because he carried an aura that seemed larger than himself, the sea-born blood of Merovec, the bees of Childeric, the flowing locks, all of it whispered that this was no ordinary king. Through campaign after campaign, Clovis expanded his realm. He struck at rivals with ruthless precision, defeating the Roman general Sagrius at Soissons, breaking the last illusion of Roman authority in northern Gaul. The chroniclers tell us of the treasure seized there and of the quarrel that followed when one of his soldiers defied him over the division of spoils. Clovis bided his time, and months later struck the man down with a calculated blow. It was not cruelty, but message the king's will was law, and defiance was death. Yet Clovis was more than a brute warlord. He understood the subtler weapons of alliance and faith. His marriage to Clotilde, a Burgundian princess of Christian belief, brought with it both political ties and spiritual influence. Through her, Clovis encountered a new path not of sword but of baptismal water. The tale of his conversion, though wrapped in hagiographic flourish, speaks of the shrewdness with which he bound myth to politics. At the Battle of Tolbiac, facing near defeat against the Alemanni, Clovis called upon the Christian God. Victory followed, and in gratitude, he allowed himself to be baptized at Rheims. This was no mere personal gesture. It was a weaving of his dynasty into the fabric of Christian sanctity. 3,000 of his warriors followed, baptizing not only their bodies, but the very destiny of the Frankish kingdom. And yet, in this act, the Merovingian mystery deepened rather than diminished, for while the chroniclers hailed Clovis as a new Constantine, whispers lingered. Had he truly renounced the old mysteries, or had he simply cloaked them in Christian vestments? The sea-born blood, the bees, the long hair all remained. The aura of the dynasty did not fade, but took on a new hue, shimmering at the border of old faith and new. With Christianity at his side, Clovis expanded further. He defeated the Visigoths at Vouillé, driving them into Spain. He subdued the Burgundians, the Alemanni, and the scattered Frankish tribes, binding Gaul beneath his banner. By the time of his death in 511, he had laid the foundation for a kingdom that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Rhine. And yet, the Merovingian way of rule was as peculiar as their origins. Unlike later dynasties that centralized power, the Merovingians divided the realm among sons, splintering it into multiple kingdoms to modernize. This seems folly, yet in their world, it was both tradition and necessity. Kingship was not about ruling a nation in the modern sense, but about embodying a sacred bond with land and people. Each son carried the bloodline, each hair flowing with the same sanctity. Dividing the realm was not fragmentation, but replication like bees from a hive, spreading yet bound to the same essence. This practice, however, sowed seeds of both strength and weakness. It ensured that the Merovingian aura spread wide, touching Paris, Metz, Reims, and beyond, yet it also bred rivalries, fratricidal wars, and intrigue that would one day erode the dynasty from within. Still, in these centuries, their power was undeniable. To the people of Gaul, the Merovingian kings were figures both political and mystical. They rode at the head of armies, led councils, and struck down rivals. But they were also guardians of relics, patrons of saints, presiders over rituals where the sacred and the political blurred into one. Their courts became places where bishops and warriors alike bent the knee, where incense mingled with the scent of sweat and steel. Consider the coronation of a Merovingian king. Unlike later rites, codified and drenched in ceremony, these early enthronements carried a raw, elemental power. A king was lifted upon a shield by warriors, a living body raised like an offering. His hair gleamed in the sun, his eyes fixed upon the horizon. The crowd cheered, not only for a man, but for a mystery renewed. For in lifting him, they affirmed not just his authority, but the sanctity of the bloodline itself. This, then, was the heart of the Merovingian rise, not conquest alone, but the marriage of conquest with aura. Other tribes had kings, but only the Franks had kings born of sea mystery, crowned with bees, sanctified by baptism, yet still marked as different. Their rise was not just political, but mythical, a dynasty carved into both history and imagination. And yet, as we trace their ascent, a shadow already stretches ahead. For the very things that made the Merovingians unique, their long hair, their myths, their strange aura, would one day make them vulnerable. Rivals would whisper that they were too strange, too pagan, too bound to old mysteries. Ambitious men would exploit their sacred aloofness, seizing power while the king sat cloaked in ritual. But that is for later. For now, in this moment, the Merovingians stand at their zenith of ascent. They have risen from sea-born whispers to thrones that command Europe. Their banners fly over Gaul. Their blood runs through courts and monasteries. Their legends weave into the very soil. They are no longer a rumor. They are power incarnate. And so we leave them poised upon the cusp of their golden age. Ahead lie splendor, intrigue, and the slow unfurling of a dynasty that would rule with both sanctity and strangeness. The long-haired kings, the sea-born heirs, the bee-crowned lords of Gaul, they have risen. The question now is, what heights would their golden age reach, and what shadows would begin to gather at its edges? The rise of the Merovingians, sharpened by sword and sanctified by myth, flowed naturally into what many later historians would call their golden age. It was not a golden age in the sense of gleaming marble palaces and the airy rationality of Rome. It was darker, earthier, and altogether more mysterious. Yet it was golden in its influence, in the breadth of its reach. and in the strange aura that clung to the dynasty even as it settled upon its throne. Picture Gaul in the 6th and 7th centuries no longer a patchwork of petty chiefs and scattered tribes, but a realm woven together under the banner of the long-haired kings. Roman roads still stretched like veins across the countryside, though cracked and worn, and through them pulsed a new vitality. The Merovingian courts at Metz, at Soissons, at Paris became centers of authority where warriors, priests, and emissaries gathered, and where decisions were made that would ripple across Europe. And yet, unlike the gleaming halls of Byzantium or the ordered splendor of later medieval courts, the Merovingian centers of power remained primal. Their halls were often of wood, not stone, hung with tapestries and animal skins, smoky with torchlight. Shields and swords lined the walls, while the scent of roasted meat and spiced mead drifted through the air. But amid this roughness, one could feel a strange sanctity. For here sat kings who were not merely men of war, but vessels of a dynasty believed to carry otherworldly inheritance. It was in these courts that the Merovingians' golden age shone brightest. Their rulers held sway over lands stretching from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, from the Atlantic shores to the borders of Burgundy and Alemannia. Their warriors marched with a confidence born not only of strength, but of belief. To fight under a Merovingian banner was to fight under the symbol of destiny, to carry into battle the weight of both legend and faith. Clovis, the dynasty's great founder, had laid the groundwork with his baptism and victories. His sons and grandsons expanded upon it, weaving alliances with bishops and abbots, endowing monasteries that became centers of both learning and sanctity. The church and the dynasty grew entwined, each needing the other. Bishops gave legitimacy to kings, while kings gave protection and land to bishops. And yet, beneath this alliance, there always pulsed something older, something the church could never fully claim: the whisper of the seaborn bloodline, the aura of long hair, the symbols of bees and sacred relics. Queens, too, played a remarkable role in this golden age. Figures such as Queen Clotilde, who persuaded Clovis to embrace baptism, and later queens like Brunhild and Fredegund wielded immense influence. They were not passive consorts, but active architects of policy and intrigue. Brunhild, in particular, stands as a figure both admired and feared, a queen who ruled in her own right, issuing laws, forging alliances, and clashing with nobles. Her reign stretched for decades, and in her sharp gaze, one glimpses the potency of Merovingian queenship, a blending of maternal sanctity and ruthless political calculation. If the kings embodied the aura of sacred blood, the queens often embodied its cunning. Together they formed a dyad male and female power, both necessary to the dynasty's survival. This balance recalls older traditions, when sovereignty was symbolized not by kings alone, but by sacred marriages between rulers and the land, often personified as a goddess or queen. In the Merovingian age, this ancient echo remained, cloaked in Christian robes, yet still resonant. One must also imagine the rituals that underpinned this golden age. When a king held court, his presence alone was a rite. His long hair, gleaming in the dim torchlight, proclaimed his sanctity as surely as any crown. To touch it was unthinkable. Chroniclers tell us that to cut a Merovingian king's hair was to strip him not merely of status, but of the very essence of his kingship. Prisoners of noble blood might be shorn to humiliate them, but a Merovingian without hair ceased to be king altogether. This taboo elevated them above mere men, for their kingship was not about weapons or wealth alone, it was woven into their very bodies. And so, the Golden Age was both political and mystical. The dynasty expanded its influence not only by force, but by shaping the imagination of its subjects. A Merovingian king was a figure of awe, a mediator between the human and the divine. Even when they erred, even when they faltered, the aura clung to them, stubborn as shadow. In this age, the Frankish realm grew rich. Trade routes carried goods from distant lands, silks from the east, spices from the Mediterranean, furs from the north. Markets buzzed with life, bells rang from new churches, and monasteries rose like beacons amid the forests. At Luxeuil, at Saint Denis, at Saint Maurice, monks prayed and copied manuscripts, preserving both Christian texts and fragments of ancient wisdom. These centers, endowed by Merovingian patronage, tied the dynasty to the sacred memory of Europe. Yet the Golden Age was never without its shadows. Intrigue thrived in the courts as much as splendor. Brothers quarreled over inheritance, queens schemed against rivals, nobles pushed against royal power. The very practice of dividing kingdoms among heirs created a landscape of shifting alliances and constant conflict. Blood was shed as often in palace chambers as on battlefields. Still, the dynasty endured. Its aura was too strong to vanish in the face of rivalry. Even when divided, even when weakened, the Merovingian kings retained their mystique. They were still the long haired kings, still the sea-born heirs, still the vessels of something older than parchment and crown. It is worth pausing here to consider what Golden Age truly means for a dynasty such as this. It was not an age of peace. It was not free of violence or betrayal, but it was golden because the dynasty's mystique remained unbroken. The people still looked upon their kings with awe. The church still needed their patronage. Rivals still acknowledged their sacred difference. The Merovingians in this age were not merely rulers, they were symbols woven into the very fabric of Gaul. And yet, already, the first cracks showed. The mayors of the palace, the chief officers who managed the royal household and military, grew in power. Nobles began to realize that while the kings carried sanctity, they did not always carry strength. The aura that made them sacred also set them apart, making them less practical as rulers. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, real power began to shift. The Merovingians still sat upon thrones, their hair uncut, their presence sacred, but behind them, others began to pull the strings. For the moment, however, the golden light held. The Frankish realm expanded. Its culture flourished in ways subtle but enduring. Its kings and queens stood as symbols of continuity in a world still emerging from Rome's shadow, and its myths deepened, twining into both memory and imagination. Picture, then, the closing of a Merovingian day in this golden age. The court has feasted, torches gutter in the hall. Outside, the night air smells of pine and smoke. The king retires, his hair unshorn, his presence still cloaked in mystery. Somewhere, monks chant psalms, elsewhere, warriors sharpen swords, and above it all, the dynasty hums with an aura that seems unbreakable, unassailable, destined to last forever. But nothing golden lasts unshadowed. Already the whispers of intrigue stir, the scent of conflict rises. The very aura that makes the Merovingians untouchable will one day make them vulnerable, for others will learn to rule in their name, while stripping their essence. Their golden age, luminous and strange, is but the calm before storms of betrayal. And so, we prepare to move from splendor to struggle, from golden halls to whispered plots, from sacred aura to the intrigues that would erode it. The Merovingians, radiant in their golden age, stand on the threshold of shadows. No golden age in history remains unshadowed. The Merovingian dynasty, radiant in its aura of sea-born legend and sacred kingship, was no exception. The very mystique that set them apart, their long hair, their symbols of bees and relics, their claim to otherworldly inheritance, proved a double-edged sword. For while it lent them awe, it also gave rivals reason to plot. Within their courts, beneath the banners and feasts, the air thickened with intrigue, betrayal, and blood. To understand the Merovingians, one must remember that theirs was not a kingdom of single succession. Unlike later dynasties that strove to preserve unity, the Merovingians divided their realm among sons. Each prince became a king, each king a rival, and each rival a potential betrayer of his brother's blood. From one womb might spring not only heirs but enemies, and in the fertile soil of Gaul, fraternal hatred bloomed as readily as loyalty. Imagine a great wooden hall, smoky with torchlight. At the long table sit the sons of Clovis Clotimer, Childebert, Clotaire, each crowned, each certain of his right. Their cups clink, their laughter rings, but beneath the surface lies calculation. One glances at another with narrowed eyes, measuring strength, counting warriors. Each knows that peace is temporary, that land divided is land contested. The inheritance of their father has not united them, it has sown the seeds of war. The chronicles tell us of these fraternal conflicts with grim clarity. Clodomir fell in battle, leaving behind sons too young to claim power. Their grandmother, Queen Clotilde wept bitterly, begging her remaining sons to protect their nephews, but ambition has little patience for innocence. Childebert and Clotaire plotted. Fearing that their dead brother's children might one day reclaim what was theirs, they sent a messenger to Clotilde with a chilling choice should her grandsons live. Though shorn of their royal hair and stripped of kingship, or should they die the queen, horrified, begged for mercy. But when the boys were brought before their uncles, innocence shining in their young eyes, the decision had already been made. One was slaughtered, the other fled into a monastery, his hair cut, his inheritance severed. This is the nature of Merovingian intrigue, brutal, intimate, wrapped not in distant politics, but in blood spilled at one's own hearth. The dynasty that claimed seaborne sanctity could be as ruthless as any warlord clan. Their aura of mystery did not soften their ambition, it cloaked it, perhaps even sharpened it. For to rule as a Merovingian was not only to hold land, but to embody a bloodline, and that bloodline allowed for no weakness. And yet, intrigue was not limited to brothers. Queens, too, became players in this dangerous game. In the Merovingian world, queens wielded extraordinary influence, not merely as consorts, but as architects of alliances and vengeance. Two names burn brightest in this regard: Brunhild and Fredegund. Brunhild, a Visigothic princess, entered the Frankish realm through marriage to King Sigebert. She was educated, ambitious, and shrewd, a woman who believed not only in her right to rule, but in her ability to do so. When her husband was murdered through the intrigues of his brother's court, Brunhild did not fade into widowhood. She seized power, ruling as regent for her young son, issuing laws, reforming administration, and clashing with nobles who sought to curb her authority. For decades, she remained a formidable presence, weaving alliances, exacting revenge, and leaving behind a legacy both admired and feared. Her rival was Fredegund, a queen of far humbler origins who rose from servant to consort of King Chilperic. Where Brunhild wielded intellect, Fredegund wielded cunning. She was ruthless, capable of orchestrating assassinations, poisoning rivals, and eliminating threats with merciless efficiency. The rivalry between these two queens became legendary, a drama of intrigue that spanned generations, embroiling their children and grandchildren in cycles of vengeance and blood. Picture them in the imagination: Brunhild, regal, her voice commanding in council, her hand firm on the reins of power; Fredegund, sharp eyed, her smile concealing daggers, her mind calculating every move like a chess master. Between them, Europe trembled, for their intrigues shaped wars, toppled kings, and altered the course of dynasties. It is tempting to dismiss these tales as mere scandal, the gossip of chroniclers hungry for drama. But beneath the personal rivalries lay a deeper truth. The Merovingian system itself invited conflict by dividing lands among heirs, by maintaining the aura of multiple sacred kings. The dynasty ensured that power was never stable. Each partition bred jealousy, each succession ignited rivalry. Queens, nobles, and bishops seized opportunities to tip the balance, and in doing so, wove a web of intrigue that bound the dynasty in perpetual unrest. Even beyond the family, betrayal lurked. The mayors of the palace, chief administrators of the royal household, grew in power during this time. At first servants, they became masters in all but name, managing armies, finances, and courts, while kings reclined in their aura of sanctity. Mayors sharpened their authority, biding their time. It was in these centuries of intrigue that the seeds of the Carolingian rise were planted, though none yet suspected it. And all the while, the aura of the Merovingians persisted, despite the bloodshed, despite the betrayals. Their sanctity endured. People still believed that their long hair carried divine essence, that their touch could heal, that their blood carried mysteries unspoken. Perhaps it was this very aura that allowed them to survive intrigue after intrigue, for while rivals could seize power temporarily, none could yet break the mystique of the dynasty. Yet shadows thickened: the murders of nephews, the poisonings of rivals, the endless wars between brothers and cousins, these chipped away at the dynasty's golden sheen. Chroniclers, once reverent, began to write of the kings with unease, noting their excesses, their debaucheries, their strange passivity as power slipped into the hands of others. The do nothing kings, they would later be called, though in truth their aura was still potent. But behind the veil, real authority was already shifting. One cannot help but see a paradox here. The Merovingians claimed sanctity, otherworldly legitimacy, a mystery that no rival could match, yet their lives were soaked in blood, their courts filled with treachery. Were they hypocrites, or was this very mixture their essence? Perhaps to carry sacred blood is also to attract darkness, as moths to a flame. Perhaps the sea-born child, Merovec, carried not only a blessing but a curse, passed down through the line. In any case, the dynasty's golden age could not remain unsullied. Conflict became the rhythm of their reign, intrigue its counterpoint. Brothers killed brothers, queens orchestrated assassinations, nobles betrayed kings, and mayors of the palace tightened their grip. The dynasty survived, but each generation left behind scars deeper than the last. Picture again the great wooden halls of the Merovingians, once filled with feasting and song. They now echo with whispered plots. A goblet is raised. Does it hold wine, beban, or poison? A son kneels before his father. Does he swear loyalty, or hide a dagger beneath his cloak? A queen smiles at her rival. Does her smile conceal forgiveness or vengeance? This was the world of the Merovingian intrigues, luminous with sanctity, shadowed with blood. Their golden aura persisted, but the cracks had begun to show. And in those cracks, the seeds of downfall were already sprouting. For dynasties do not fall in a single blow. They erode slowly, their strength sapped not only by enemies without, but by betrayals within. The Merovingians, once radiant, were now entering that slow erosion. Their conflicts and intrigues had not yet destroyed them, but they had set the stage for the turning points to come. And so, the question emerges like smoke curling upward. How long can a dynasty survive when its sanctity is devoured by its own blood? When its aura cloaks not only mystery, but murder? The answer lies in the next chapter, when intrigue ripens into catastrophe, when a major event shifts the course of the dynasty and the golden age begins to dim. History is rarely a smooth river. It flows in currents and whirlpools, and sometimes in sudden floods that sweep away everything familiar. For the Merovingians, whose aura of sanctity had carried them from sea-born myth to thrones of Gaul, the 7th century brought such floods. Their golden glow dimmed, not by gradual twilight alone, but through events so sharp, so bloody, that the dynasty itself seemed to stumble, wounded, though not yet fallen. One such turning point lies in the bitter rivalry that consumed the dynasty after the death of Clotaire, son of Clovis. His kingdom, and vast and glittering, was divided among his heirs, as Merovingian custom dictated. What might have been a gesture of fairness instead sowed the seeds of disaster. For to divide land among brothers was to breed war. To divide power among kings was to invite intrigue, and to divide destiny was to weaken sanctity. So began the long and brutal conflict between the heirs, conflict most memorably embodied in the struggle between two queens, Brunhild and Fredegund. Their rivalry was not a mere quarrel of women in the shadows, it was a war of wills that would shape the very destiny of the dynasty. Brunhild, widowed by assassination, stepped forward as regent for her young son, a Visigothic princess by birth. She carried herself with the poise of ancient courts and the steel of hardened survival. She governed with sharp intellect, issuing laws, building alliances, and striving to keep her kingdom strong. Her very presence at the helm of power was a turning point, for she represented not a passive queen, but a ruling force, a monarch in all but name. Fredegund, her rival, could not have been more different in origin. Once a servant, she had risen to queen through cunning and ruthlessness. Where Brunhild wielded law, Fredegund wielded daggers. Assassination became her art, intrigue her craft. Chroniclers painted her as a figure both feared and despised, yet undeniably effective. Together, these two women wove a tapestry of blood and vengeance that engulfed the dynasty. Imagine the Merovingian realms in this period, palaces seething with whispers, courts trembling with suspicion, warriors pledging oaths with one hand while sharpening blades with the other. A feast might end in celebration or in murder. A marriage might seal an alliance or spark a war. The line between throne and grave grew perilously thin. In this storm of rivalry, one event stands out as a moment When the dynasty's mystique began to crack, after years of struggle, Brunhild's reign came to a violent end. Captured by her enemies, those who had once bent the knee, but now feared her power, she was condemned not with the dignity owed a queen, but with the brutality reserved for the defeated. The chroniclers write of her death with morbid fascination. She was bound to a wild horse, dragged mercilessly until her body was torn. A queen, a regent, a ruler of decades, ended not with reverence but with cruelty, her name spat out by those who feared her even in her final breath. And yet, in that horror, her legend only deepened, for her death symbolized more than personal defeat. It symbolized the end of Merovingian dignity, the point at which their sanctity was no longer unassailable. If a queen of such stature could be humiliated, what protection did their sacred aura truly offer? This was a turning point, not only in politics, but in perception. For centuries, the Merovingians had cultivated an image of untouchability. Their long hair, their bloodline, their aura had set them apart. But now, as queens were slaughtered, nephews murdered, and kings manipulated by their own officials, the dynasty's otherworldly sheen began to tarnish. They still ruled, but less as sovereigns and more as shadows. Another decisive shift came in the rise of the mayors of the palace. At first mere stewards of the royal household, they grew into power brokers, controlling armies, finances, and the machinery of governance. Kings, wrapped in their aura of sanctity, often withdrew into ritual and symbol, leaving the burdens of rule to these officials. What had once been a position of service became, quietly, a throne in all but name. It is here that we glimpse the slow birth of a new dynasty, the Carolingians, though their rise would not be complete for another century. Men like Papin of Herstal and Charles Martel began to overshadow their Merovingian kings, wielding power while leaving the long-haired monarchs as figureheads. The people might still believe in the sacred bloodline, but the practical affairs of rule had shifted elsewhere. The turning point was not a single blow, but a slow erosion, like water wearing down stone. And yet, amid these shifts, the dynasty still carried its mysteries. The golden bees of Childeric, the sea-born tail of Merovag, the sacred hair of kings, these symbols persisted, even as real authority waned. Perhaps this is why the Merovingians endured as long as they did. Their aura could not be easily erased. Even when manipulated, even when powerless, they still embodied something otherworldly. Still, history marks turning points with blood, and one cannot ignore the cycles of violence that scarred these centuries. Brothers continued to betray brothers, queens to plot against queens, assassinations, poisonings, and sudden deaths became the rhythm of the dynasty, and each betrayal chipped away at the myth of invincibility. What use was sacred blood if it could not prevent murder? What value was long hair if it could not stop humiliation? The turning point then was not a single event, but a convergence of many: the death of Brunhild, the rise of Fredegund, the growing dominance of mayors. The endless fraternal wars together, they shifted the Merovingians from sacred rulers to sacred symbols. They still sat upon thrones, but their hands no longer held the reins of destiny. And yet, one must remember to the people. Their aura lingered. Farmers still believed their kings carried healing powers. Monks still recorded their names with reverence. Warriors still swore loyalty to the long-haired bloodline. The turning point was not in faith, but in function. The kings became vessels of sanctity, while others wielded power. It was a subtle shift, but one that would echo across centuries. Imagine standing in a Merovingian hall during this turning point. The king sits upon his throne, hair flowing, eyes distant. Around him, bishops chant blessings, nobles bow, and warriors cheer. The aura is intact, shimmering as it always had. But behind the throne, a mayor whispers to courtiers, directing orders, commanding armies. The king is sacred, but the mayor is sovereign. And in that quiet shift, history itself turns. Thus, the Golden Age gave way to shadow. The Merovingians did not fall outright, but they stumbled. Their sanctity, once shield and sword, became veil and mask. Their power slipped into the hands of others. And though their dynasty would linger for generations, their fate was sealed in these turning points when blood, betrayal, and the quiet rise of rivals marked the beginning of the end. Still, The mystery remains, for even as their power waned, their legend grew. Perhaps this is the strangest twist of all, that in decline, the Merovingians became more mythic, not less. Their sea-born origin, their bees, their relics, their aura of otherness, these did not die with their power. They endured, whispering into the centuries, leaving behind a mystery that no turning point could erase. The dynasty had changed course. Its golden brilliance now shimmered with cracks. Ahead lay stranger signs, uncanny clues that hinted at deeper mysteries hidden beneath the surface of history. The question now was not merely how the Merovingians ruled, but what secrets they carried, secrets so strange that later generations would suspect a deliberate cover up. And so, with the blood of queens, the betrayal of brothers, and the rise of shadow kings behind us, we turn to the next stage of the story, the strange clues left behind, fragments that refuse to settle, hints that the Merovingian mystery was never only about politics, but about something deeper, older, and concealed. History often leaves us with silences more eloquent than words. When we look upon the Merovingians, we find not only the chronicles of battles, the genealogies of kings, the edicts of queens, but also the peculiar details, the small fragments that resist explanation, that glow with strangeness like sparks in the dark. These clues, scattered across centuries, are what sustain the Merovingian mystery. They suggest that behind the veil of politics and power lay something deeper, something that later history sought to cover, and perhaps still does. Let us begin with the bees. When Childeric's tomb was unearthed in the 17th century at Tournai, the astonished discoverers found not only weapons, jewelry, and regalia, but also some 300 golden bees, tiny, delicate, each carefully fashioned. They lay like a swarm preserved in death. To the modern eye, they might appear ornamental, mere decoration, yet to those who understand symbols, their presence hums with resonance. In the ancient world, bees were no ordinary creatures. Egyptians saw them as tears of the sun god Ra, born from his weeping. Greeks associated them with prophecy, with the priestesses of Delphi, who were called the bee maidens. Early Christians spoke of bees as images of resurrection, for they disappeared in winter and reemerged in spring. They also represented a kind of immortal order, a harmony of nature that echoed divine creation. Why, then, were they buried with Childeric? Was it an echo of pagan sanctity, a declaration that the Merovingians were not merely kings, but keepers of a secret knowledge of immortality? Or were they a symbol passed down from a lineage more ancient than Gaul, carried across lands and ages like a hidden thread? Curiously, centuries later, Napoleon adopted the bee as his own symbol, casting aside the fleur-de-lis of later French kings. Did he sense, consciously or not, that in reviving the bee he was reaching back to an older sanctity, tapping into a legacy France had buried but not forgotten? The golden swarm of Childeric still hums, a clue not erased by time. Then there is the hair. To call the Merovingians the long-haired kings was no idle nickname. Their uncut locks were said to embody their right to rule. To shear them was not merely to humiliate, but to disinherit. Chroniclers record that when rivals sought to dethrone a Merovingian, they did not always kill him. Instead, they cut his hair, sending him to a monastery where he lived as a monk, still royal in blood, but stripped of power. This taboo raises unsettling questions. Why was hair so essential to their kingship? Was it only a relic of ancient Germanic custom, or something more? Hair has long carried mystical significance. In the story of Samson, his strength resided in his locks, and to cut them was to strip him of divine power. Among druids, priests, and shamans, hair often served as a conduit of spiritual energy. The Merovingians, by binding their kingship to hair, may have signaled that their power was not merely political, but physical, embodied, almost magical. Their hair made them kings, not because of appearance, but because it was believed to carry something unseen, something inherited and unbroken. Imagine, then, a deposed Merovingian prince, his hair shorn, sitting in the cold silence of a monastery. The scissors have done what no army could achieve. They have cut him off from destiny. Yet does not the very strangeness of this custom suggest something hidden? Why should hair, so easily grown again, be considered a permanent severing, unless perhaps it was not the hair alone, but the ritual, the act of cutting that symbolized the destruction of a mystery, a clue, then not of vanity, but of something sacred veiled beneath the surface. There are other fragments equally haunting. Some chronicles speak of Merovingian kings possessing healing powers, their very touch capable of easing illness. Others suggest they had a strange foresight, a gift for prophecy. Was this mere hagiography, or did the people genuinely believe their kings bore supernatural gifts? If so, were these gifts remnants of older traditions when kings were also shamans, priests, mediators between men and gods, or were they echoes of something else, the seaborne ancestry of Merovac, still shimmering in the bloodline, manifesting as powers unexplainable by reason? Another clue lies in the peculiar relationship between the Merovingians and relics. Throughout their reign, they seemed drawn to sacred objects, crosses, bones of saints, mysterious treasures unearthed from Roman ruins. Unlike later dynasties, which often used relics for propaganda, the Merovingians seemed almost entwined with them, as though relic and king formed a shared aura. Chroniclers note that kings rode to battle carrying relics, that queens built monasteries not merely as acts of piety, but as guardianships of sacred power. It is tempting to see here not mere devotion, but recognition that their dynasty itself was a relic, a living relic, carrying within it something as holy or as dangerous as the bones of saints. The strangest clue of all may be the silences, for when one combs through the chronicles, one finds gaps, eras glossed over, deeds unrecorded, memories blurred. Why did chroniclers, so detailed in some matters, seem reluctant in others? Why are the Merovingians remembered as do-nothing kings when evidence suggests they still held symbolic power unmatched by their rivals? Was this forgetfulness accidental or deliberate? Was history itself complicit in covering what should not be spoken? Consider also the myth of Merovec's conception, the Queen by the Sea, the encounter with the strange creature. Scholars call it a legend, a tale to explain a name. Yet legends are themselves clues, fragments of memory reshaped into story. What if the tale of the sea creature was not invention, but echo, a remembrance of a real ritual, a real belief, perhaps even a real event? Was the sea not only a place of mystery, but a metaphor for hidden ancestry, for a lineage not entirely human? Could this be why the church, even as it crowned Merovingian kings, remained wary of them because their bloodline whispered of something it could not control? Whispers grew in later centuries that the Merovingians guarded a secret, perhaps even the greatest secret of Christendom. Some spoke of them as descendants of a holy bloodline, carrying within them the trace of Christ himself. Others suggested they were custodians of hidden knowledge, guardians of treasures buried deep in Gaul's soil. Though these whispers emerged long after their fall, they may have been fueled by the strange clues left behind the bees, the hair, the relics, the silences. And then there is geography, itself a clue. Many Merovingian centers of power, Soissons, Metz, Reims, are built upon older sacred sites, places where druids once sacrificed, where Roman temples stood, where rivers met in mysterious confluence. Did the Merovingians choose these places deliberately, sensing the lingering power in the earth, or did the places choose them, binding their dynasty to ancient forces that long predated Christianity? Even their burial practices suggest enigma. The tomb of Childeric, with its golden bees and weapons, speaks not of Christian humility, but of pagan splendor. Later Merovingian burials often mingled Christian symbols with older ones, as though the dynasty itself could not be contained within one faith. They were baptized, crowned, blessed by bishops, and yet they carried into their graves signs of something older, something never fully surrendered. What are we to make of these strange clues? Bees that hum with immortality, hair that embodies kingship, relics entwined with blood, silences in chronicles, myths of seaborne ancestry. Taken singly, each might be dismissed as custom or coincidence. Taken together, they form a pattern too insistent to ignore, a pattern that suggests the Merovingians carried something others feared, something worth erasing, something that made them at once rulers and mysteries. Imagine walking among the ruins of an old Merovingian church at dusk. The air is cool, heavy with moss and stone. You see fragments of carvings, bees, crosses, patterns that do not quite fit. You run your fingers across them and feel a shiver. The chronicles do not explain this. The guides do not speak of it, but the stones whisper there was more here than history will tell. The Merovingians, in their conflicts and turning points, left behind not answers, but echoes, strange clues like scattered bones, waiting for those willing to piece them together. Perhaps the dynasty fell not because it was weak, but because it carried something others wished to hide. Perhaps their long hair, their bees, their relics, their myths were too dangerous to endure. And so, the story bends now toward their fall. Not a fall of swords alone, but of concealment, of erasure, of deliberate forgetting. Their aura, their sanctity, their very mystery became their undoing. Yet even in decline, the strange clues persist, refusing to be silenced. The question deepens, what secret did the Merovingians carry that demanded such erasure? What was it in their blood, their symbols, their legends, that later rulers could not allow to survive? We now step into the twilight of the dynasty, into the mystery of their disappearance. The clues grow stranger, the shadows darker, the silence more profound. Every dynasty rises on pillars of myth, power, and blood. Yet when it falls, the manner of its decline often tells us more than the story of its ascent. The Merovingians, whose sea-born legends and long-haired sanctity had carried them from obscurity to the throne of Gaul, did not collapse in a sudden storm. Their disappearance was stranger than that. It was a slow erosion, a deliberate fading, as though hands unseen had drawn a veil over them. Their story does not end in a single blow, but in silence, a silence so profound that it feels more like concealment than mere decay. The chroniclers of later centuries called them les rois fainéants, the do-nothing kings. The phrase lingers like a sneer, dismissing entire generations as idle figureheads, but this dismissal itself is curious, for in truth the Merovingians continued to reign for centuries after their supposed decline. Their blood still flowed, their hair still grew, their thrones were not abandoned, yet their power diminished, shifting quietly into the hands of others, the mayoris domus, the mayors of the palace. Here lies the first strange detail. The Merovingians did not fall to foreign invasion, nor were they overthrown in a single coup. Instead, they were hollowed out from within. The kings retained their aura, the sacred long hair, the ritual presence, the symbolic kingship, but real power was seized by those who stood behind them. It was as though the dynasty had been placed under glass, preserved as a relic while its substance was drained away. The rise of the mayors of the palace began innocuously enough. These officials were tasked with managing the royal household, administering estates, and commanding troop. Yisi. Over time, their influence grew, for they controlled the machinery of governance while the kings embodied sanctity. The balance seemed stable at first, kings as symbols, mayors as administrators, but gradually the roles inverted. The mayors became sovereign in all but name, while the kings became shadows, long-haired dolls upon thrones they no longer ruled. One cannot help but sense a deliberate strategy in this arrangement. Why not depose the kings outright? Why keep them at all? If they did nothing, unless their presence still carried a necessity, unless their blood, their aura, their mystery was still too dangerous to erase completely. Better, perhaps, to leave them in place, but powerless. Better to let them sit, veiled in ritual, while others ruled through their silence. This slow strangling of power reached its climax with the rise of the Carolingians. Figures such as Charles Martel, famed for halting the Muslim advance at the Battle of Tours in 732, wielded immense authority, commanding armies and ruling kingdoms. Yet they did so not as kings, but as mayors of the palace, still nominally serving the Merovingian monarchs. It is here that the silence grows deafening. Why did the dynasty not resist? Why did the sacred aura not rally armies to defend it? Was it that the people, though they revered the king's sanctity, had come to accept that sanctity was not enough? Or was it that the dynasty itself had been deliberately muzzled, its true power cut away by forces more insidious than mere politics? The final act of this disappearance came with the reign of Childeric III, the last Merovingian king. By then, the dynasty was but a whisper. Childeric sat on the throne, his hair long as tradition demanded, but his authority hollow. In 751, Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne, and heir to the Carolingian ambition, made his move. With the support of the papacy, he deposed Childeric and claimed the crown for himself. The chroniclers record that Childeric's hair was cut, his sanctity stripped, and he was sent to a monastery. This act was more than political, it was symbolic, ritualistic. To shear the king was to kill the dynasty without shedding blood. It was to unmake the mystery, to dissolve the aura. No execution, no battle, no massacre, just scissors, silence, and exile. The dynasty ended not in fire, but in forgetting. But here lies the deepest strangeness. Why did the church bless this act? Why did the papacy, guardian of Christian legitimacy, side with Pepin and against a dynasty that had once delivered Gaul into Christendom? Clovis's baptism, Clotilde's prayers, the alliance with bishops all seemed to count for nothing in the end, unless, of course, the church had reasons to wish the Merovingians erased, unless their aura, their legends of seaborne ancestry, their whispers of sacred blood had become too dangerous to endure. Better to replace them with a dynasty more pliable, more controllable, more acceptable to Rome. Some historians suggest that the Merovingians, bound to their aura of sanctity, had become impractical rulers in a world that demanded efficiency. Others hint at deeper motives, that the church feared their claims to sacred blood, feared that their legends might rival or undermine the Christian narrative. Were the whispers true that the Merovingians were not only kings, but custodians of a secret bloodline? If so, the silence around their disappearance begins to look less like neglect and more like conspiracy. Even the memory of the dynasty seems deliberately blurred. The phrase do nothing kings reduces centuries of reign to caricature. Their achievements, patronage of monasteries, laws, diplomacy are obscured. Their legends are dismissed as fables. Their relics vanish. Childeric's golden bees, discovered in 1653, were mostly stolen and melted down. Only a handful remain. Is this not a fitting metaphor for the dynasty itself? Treasures stolen, melted, forgotten, leaving behind only fragments. And yet, the fragments whisper still. The Merovingians may have disappeared from thrones, but not from imagination. Their mystery lingers precisely because their fall was so strange, so quiet, so veiled. Dynasties that die in flames are remembered for their tragedy. Dynasties that fade in silence are remembered for their secrecy. The Merovingians belong to the latter. Their disappearance is less an ending than an erasure, a deliberate covering up that invites speculation. Imagine walking into a monastery in the late 8th century. Behind its walls sits Childeric, the last Merovingian, his hair shorn, his aura stripped. He chants prayers with other monks, his life narrowed to ritual and silence. Outside, Pepin and his sons rule, the Carolingians rise, the church prospers, the world moves on. And yet, within those walls, a memory lingers. The blood of Merovec still flows in Childeric's veins. The bees still hum in the shadows. The seaborn child's inheritance has not been extinguished, only hidden. This is the essence of the Merovingian fall, not a collapse, but a concealment. They vanished not because they failed, but because they carried something others wished to erase. Their disappearance was not the end of their story, but the beginning of their legend. For in being silenced, they became eternal whispers. And so, we arrive at the paradox: the dynasty died, and yet it did not. Their thrones were taken, their hair shorn, their memory mocked, but their mystery endured, stronger than ever. The silence around them became louder than any chronicle. Their disappearance became their immortality. The next question, then, is what remains? What fragments of their presence still echo in Europe? What legacies, visible or hidden, survived the scissors and Recmaus and the silence? What traces of the Merovingians linger still, humming like bees in the ruins of history? For though they disappeared from thrones, they did not disappear from time. The Merovingians, though dethroned, did not vanish. Their disappearance from power was not their erasure from memory. Indeed, the paradox of their fate is that in losing their crowns, they gained a shadowy immortality. Their golden bees, their long hair, their seaborne myths, their whispered sanctity, these fragments lingered, scattering like seeds across Europe. Some took root in place names, others in monasteries, others in folklore, and still others in whispers of bloodlines that even now stir the imagination. The dynasty's legacy is not the straightforward inheritance of kingship, but the haunting persistence of a mystery. Let us begin with the land itself, for landscapes remember what chronicles forget. Across France, Belgium, and Germany, echoes of the Merovingians remain. Villages and towns bear names tied to their reign, reminders that these kings once ruled not only courts, but the very soil. In Metz, in Soissons, in Reims, their presence is still faintly etched. Monasteries they endowed, Saint Denis near Paris, Luxieuil in Burgundy, Saint Maurice in the Alps stand as living monuments. Their stones have weathered centuries, yet beneath their arches, one still feels the aura of long haired kings who once walked their cloisters. Saint Denis, in particular, became a repository of Merovingian legacy. Clotharoin and Dagobertois were buried there, their tombs guarded by monks, their memory preserved in chant and stone. Dagobert, one of the last Merovingians to wield true power, was remembered with particular reverence. His name clung to legends, his tomb a site of pilgrimage. Even as later dynasties mocked the Merovingians as do nothing kings, the people still prayed at their graves as though sanctity lingered in their bones. Folklore, too, carried their memory. In rural France, tales persisted of long haired kings who could heal with a touch, whose presence sanctified the land. Stories of queens like Brunhild and Fredegund, though twisted by chroniclers into caricatures of ambition and cruelty, survived in oral tradition as figures of fear and fascination. The people did not forget. They whispered their names by firesides, told their stories to children, and carried fragments of their legends forward through centuries. Even the symbols of the dynasty endured. The bees of Childeric, though stolen and melted, left behind a resonance that leapt across time. When Napoleon sought to crown himself emperor, he turned not to the fleur-de-lis of the Capetian kings, but to the bee. In adorning his robes with golden bees, he reached back past medieval France to the Merovingians, declaring himself heir not to the dynasty of Paris, but to something older, stranger, more primal. In that moment, the bee once more hummed with royal power. The hair, too, lingered in memory. Medieval chroniclers, though eager to dismiss the Merovingians, still recorded with fascination their taboo against shearing. Later legends spoke of the long-haired ones as half-mystical figures, their locks shimmering with an aura of otherworldliness. The cutting of Childeric III's hair in 751 became an archetype of dynastic destruction, remembered not merely as humiliation, but as ritualistic annihilation. It was as if the hair itself symbolized the soul of the dynasty, and in cutting it, Europe severed a sacred cord. But perhaps the strangest and most enduring legacy lies in the whispers of bloodline. Long after the Merovingians were deposed, legends persisted that their descendants lived on, not in thrones, but in shadows. Some claimed that the line intermarried with noble houses of Europe, seeding itself quietly through generations. Others went further, suggesting that the Merovingian bloodline was no ordinary royal inheritance, but something sacred, perhaps even carrying within it the trace of Christ himself. This speculation, though centuries removed from the dynasty, found fertile ground in Europe's imagination. The notion of a holy bloodline, suppressed and concealed, gave rise to myths that entwined the Merovingians with the deepest mysteries of Christianity. Modern theories, popularized in books and whispered through secret societies, suggest that the Merovingians were guardians of hidden truths, of relics like the Holy Grail, of texts suppressed by the Church, of a lineage too dangerous to acknowledge. While such ideas remain speculative, they point to something undeniable. The Merovingians linger not merely as historical figures, but as symbols of secrecy, of suppressed knowledge, of mysteries left deliberately in shadow. One may ask why the dynasty in particular attracted such legends. Perhaps it is precisely because of their strange disappearance. Dynasties that fall in battle are remembered as tragedies. Dynasties that fade in scandal are remembered as cautionary tales. But the Merovingians did neither. They simply dissolved, their hair cut, their thrones passed to others, their memory dismissed as do nothing. Such a silence demands explanation, and into that silence, imagination poured its myths. Archaeology adds its own layer of legacy. Though Childeric's tomb was plundered, fragments remain signet rings, weapons, bees. Dagobert's tomb still stands at Saint Denis. Other Merovingian burials, scattered across Gaul, have yielded treasures, brooches, swords, jeweled relics that blend pagan artistry with Christian symbols. These finds remind us that the dynasty stood at a crossroads of belief, embodying both old and new. Each artifact that hums with dual resonance, a cross alongside a rune, a bee alongside a chiro, a sword buried beside relics of saints, the Merovingians did not abandon their mystery, they carried it into their very graves. Even in law and governance, their legacy persisted. The Salic law, codified under Clovis, endured for centuries as a cornerstone of European legal tradition. Later dynasties, though they mocked the Merovingians, still built upon the legal foundations they laid. In this sense, the dynasty's hand remained in Europe long after their hair was cut and their crowns removed. Perhaps most haunting of all is the sense that the Merovingians remain unfinished, unlike the Capetians, who reigned for centuries, or the Carolingians, who rose and fell in glory. The Merovingians end in ambiguity. Their disappearance feels less like death and more like concealment. Their legacy is not a closed book, but an open question, a thread still dangling. Imagine standing in the crypt of Saint Denis, where Merovingian kings rest in stone coffins. The air is cool, heavy with incense and centuries of prayer. You trace your hand across the carved names, some worn nearly smooth, around you. Later kings of France loom in marble, their effigies grand and certain, but the Merovingian tombs are quieter, humbler, half forgotten, and yet in their silence, they stir more questions than answers. What secrets did they carry? What was it about their bloodline that invited erasure? Why do they linger so stubbornly in Europe's imagination? This, then, is their legacy, not merely laws, not merely towns and monasteries, not merely artifacts of gold and stone. Their true legacy is the mystery itself. To speak of the Merovingians is to speak of questions left deliberately unanswered, of clues scattered like bees across history, of whispers that refuse to die. They are remembered not for what they did, but for what they might have guarded, for what they might have been. And so, the dynasty's disappearance becomes paradoxical. They lost their crowns, yet became eternal. They were mocked as idle, yet remembered as mysterious. They vanished from history, yet linger in legend. Their legacy is the silence that hums louder than words, the absence that feels like presence, the erasure that creates immortality. But as the centuries rolled on, the silence did not remain unbroken. Theories arose, interpretations multiplied, whispers turned into elaborate speculations. The Merovingians became fodder for modern imagination, for secret societies, for conspiracy, for romance. In their absence, myths blossomed like wildflowers. The question then shifts from what the Merovingians were to what they became in memory. How did later ages interpret them? What theories arose to explain their mystery, and how, in being explained, were they transformed into something more mythic than historical? Thus, we leave their legacy in stone and soil and turn now to the legacy of imagination, the modern theories that swirl like fog around the name of the Merovingians, theories that tell us as much about our hunger for mystery as about the dynasty itself. The Merovingians might have slipped quietly into the cloisters of forgotten monasteries, their long hair shorn and their crowns taken, yet they have never entirely left us. Their shadows wander still, but no longer bound to the annals of early medieval history alone. Instead, they stride through a landscape of speculation, myth, and mystery. In the centuries after their fall, the Merovingians became something stranger than kings. They became symbols of secrets, of bloodlines whispered about in candlelit rooms, of the possibility that history itself holds concealed truths too dangerous to reveal. To explore the modern theories of the Merovingians is to enter a labyrinth where fact and legend intertwine. Some corridors lead us into plausible historical interpretations, others into the shimmering realm of conspiracy. Yet all of them, whether grounded in evidence or not, reveal how deeply the dynasty has embedded itself in the European imagination. The sacred bloodline hypothesis. Perhaps the most famous of these theories is the claim that the Merovingians were not only kings, but carriers of a sacred bloodline, the descendants of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. According to this hypothesis, which gained wide circulation in the 20th century, the crucifixion did not end Christ's earthly story. Instead, Mary Magdalene, then pregnant with his child, fled to Gaul. There, her descendants intermarried with local nobility, eventually producing the Merovingian line. To mainstream historians, this idea seems fantastical. There is little in the contemporary sources to support it, and yet its allure is undeniable, for it reframes the Merovingians not as obscure Frankish rulers, but as heirs to the holiest of lineages, guardians of a secret that could shake the very foundations of Christendom. The church, so the theory goes, feared this truth, and so it sanctioned their erasure, replacing them with the more pliant Carolingians. Books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, 1982 popularized this idea, weaving together fragments of medieval lore, apocryphal gospels, and modern speculation. The theory found new life in popular culture through novels such as The Da Vinci Code, embedding itself in the wider imagination. Whether one accepts or rejects it, the theory reflects something powerful, the enduring hunger to believe that the Merovingians were more than kings, that they were custodians of a truth the world was not meant to know. The Grail connection. Entwined with the bloodline hypothesis is the legend of the Holy Grail. In medieval romances, the Grail appears as a cup, a chalice of divine mystery, the vessel of Christ's blood. But in modern interpretations, the Grail becomes not an object, but a lineage. The very word sangreal, so the theory goes, can be read not only as San Graal, Holy Grail, but as Sangreal, royal blood. In this reading, the Grail is the bloodline of Christ, preserved in secret through the Merovingians, Knights Templar, Cathars, secret brotherhoods, all are drawn into the web. Cast as guardians of this truth, the Merovingians, dethroned yet never extinguished, become the living Grail. Their survival in whispers and myths is itself proof of their hidden role. Once more, the historical evidence is tenuous, yet the symbolic resonance is immense. For the Grail is, at heart, a story of concealment and revelation, of a treasure hidden in plain sight. To link it to the Merovingians is to suggest that their very disappearance was the concealment of the Grail itself, that to erase them was to bury the holiest treasure of all, not in stone, but in blood. The Priory of Sion. Another thread of modern theory claims that a secret society has, for centuries, protected the Merovingian legacy, the Priory of Sion. According to this story, the priory was founded in 1099 during the First Crusade, dedicated to preserving the bloodline of Christ through the Merovingians. Its supposed grand masters included luminaries like Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton, men whose genius in this telling was bound to their guardianship of the secret. The documents that first brought the priory to public attention in the 20th century have since been revealed as modern fabrications, yet the myth persists, in part because it offers an alluring narrative that beneath the surface of history, secret guardians have moved unseen, ensuring that the Merovingian mystery never dies. It is less important whether the Priory of Sion existed in fact than that it exists in imagination, entwined forever with the dynasty it claims to protect. Occult and esoteric interpretations. Beyond Christian reinterpretations, other theories situate the Merovingians in the realm of pagan survival and occult power. Their seaborn myth, their bee symbolism, their taboo against cutting hair all point, some argue, to an inheritance of pre-Christian spirituality. In this view, the Merovingians were not heirs of Christ, but heirs of druids, shamans, and priest kings whose power was older than Rome. Their kingship was sacred not because of the church, but because of the land itself, the rivers, the forests, the sacred groves of Gaul. Their disappearance, then, was not merely political but spiritual, the triumph of a new order over an older magic. Some esoteric traditions even suggest that the Merovingians were not entirely human, that their sea-born ancestor Merovec signaled a hybrid lineage, blending humanity with something other. Was the sea creature of the legend merely metaphor, or was it a memory of something stranger, a being half divine, half monstrous, whose blood still shimmered in Merovingian veins? The cover up hypothesis. Underlying all these theories is a single question: why were the Merovingians so thoroughly diminished in memory? Other dynasties fell, but their stories remained intact. The Merovingians, by contrast, were dismissed, mocked, and blurred into caricature. Was this merely the result of Carolingian propaganda, eager to legitimize its own rule, or was there something more, something dangerous in the Merovingian legacy that demanded suppression? If one follows this line of thought, the Do Nothing King's label becomes less history than cover up. To reduce them to irrelevance was to ensure their mysteries remained buried. The cutting of Childeric III's hair becomes not merely deposition, but ritual erasure, the symbolic act of silencing a bloodline too unsettling to endure. The disappearance of Childeric III's golden bees, melted and lost, becomes not theft, but obliteration. The gaps in chronicles, the dismissals of chroniclers, the mockery of later historians, all become part of a pattern of concealment. And what was concealed? Was it the bloodline of Christ, as some whisper, the survival of pagan kingship, as others believe, or simply the unsettling truth that the Merovingians embodied an aura of sanctity the church could never fully control? Whatever the case, the sense remains that their memory was not merely lost, it was buried. Why these theories endure? What makes the Merovingians so fertile for speculation is precisely the ambiguity of their history. They are neither fully illuminated nor entirely forgotten. They exist in the twilight of memory, their aura intact but their deeds obscured. Into this twilight, imagination pours. We live in an age that hungers for mysteries, for hidden truths, for the possibility that beneath official history lies another story. The Merovingians offer exactly this: a dynasty whose disappearance feels like conspiracy, whose symbols shimmer with strangeness, whose very erasure becomes proof of their significance. Whether one sees in them the bloodline of Christ, the survival of pagan sanctity, or simply the victims of Carolingian propaganda, one cannot escape the sense that their story is unfinished. Imagine sitting in a quiet library at midnight, the only light a single candle. Before you lie the chronicles of Gregory of Tours, the records of Saint Denis, the scattered fragments of Merovingian burials. The words are sparse, the gaps many. You lean closer, tracing with your finger the names, the half-told tales, the silences, and in the silence you feel it: the hum of bees, the shimmer of long hair, the whisper of sea-born blood. The mystery has not ended. It waits, even now, for those willing to listen. Thus, the Merovingians, once kings of Gaul, become kings of imagination. Their true power, perhaps, was never in crowns or swords, but in the mystery they left behind, a mystery that that persists in theories and legends, that echoes still across the centuries. And so, we leave the realm of speculation to return to the soil. For if the modern theories swirl like fog, the ground itself holds its own testimony. Archaeological discoveries and ancient texts, unearthed long after the dynasty's fall, provide tangible fragments that deepen the enigma. Archaeological discoveries or ancient texts. If legends are like fog, rising and drifting without form, then archaeology is the solid ground beneath stones, bones, and objects that resist forgetting. Yet when it comes to the Merovingians, even the solid ground seems to shimmer with mystery. Each discovery, each fragment of text, seems less to clarify than to deepen the enigma. For the Merovingian world is not preserved in grand monuments like those of Rome, nor in sprawling libraries like those of Byzantium. It survives in shards, in crypts, in half-remembered manuscripts, each piece humming with a strangeness that keeps the dynasty alive in the imagination. The tomb of Childeric I. Perhaps no discovery has cast a longer shadow than the unearthing of Childeric's tomb in 1653. In Tournai, Belgium, workmen stumbled upon a chamber filled with objects that seemed to glimmer with both power and mystery. Here lay Childeric, father of Clovis, the first truly historical Merovingian king. And yet what surrounded him was not the austere piety of a Christian burial, but the lavish splendor of something older, something stranger. Weapons encrusted with gold and garnet, A sword so richly adorned it seemed ceremonial, more relic than weapon, jewels and ornaments fit for a chieftain of great renown. But most striking of all were the bees, nearly 300 tiny golden insects, each crafted with exquisite detail. They lay scattered across the burial, as if swarming in silence around their king. The discovery stunned Europe. Scholars puzzled over the bees. Were they symbols of resurrection, tokens of immortality, or echoes of some forgotten cult? Linking the Merovingians to mysteries older than Christianity, the bees vanished soon after, stolen from the treasury in Paris, melted down for profit, their swarm dispersed. Only a handful remain, fragile survivors of a lost treasure. Yet their image lingers, humming through time, a symbol that refuses to die. The tomb also yielded a signet ring bearing Childeric's name and title, the first tangible proof of the dynasty's kingship. Here was not legend, but fact. And yet, even this fact carried strangeness for the ring. While Roman in style, proclaimed Childeric not as a Roman official, but as a king in his own right. It was as though he stood with one foot in empire and the other in myth, bridging two worlds while belonging fully to neither. Saint Denis and the tomb of Dagobert, why? If Childeric's tomb was a burst of pagan splendor, Dagobert's tomb at Saint Denis was a monument of Christian kingship. Dagobert I, who reigned in the early 7th century, was remembered as one of the last powerful Merovingian rulers, a king who combined authority with the dynasty's sacred aura. His burial at Saint Denis marked a shift here. The dynasty embraced Christian sanctity while still carrying its older mystery. Saint Denis became the necropolis of French kings, a tradition that began with the Merovingians. Within its crypts, Merovingian burials whisper through stone, their presence overshadowed by later Capetian grandeur. Archaeologists exploring these tombs have found traces of richly adorned burials, gold, weapons, crosses mingled with older motifs. The mingling itself is telling, for it shows that the Merovingians did not abandon their older symbols when they embraced Christianity. They carried both bees and crosses, swords and relics, sea myths and baptismal waters, all bound together in one aura. Legends, too, attach themselves to Dagobert's tomb. Medieval stories claim that his soul was once dragged to hell for his sins, only to be rescued by Saint Denis himself. Such tales blur history with morality play, but they also reveal something deeper, that Dagobert, and by extension the dynasty, remain figures of spiritual fascination, never wholly embraced, never wholly condemned. Other burials and treasures. Across France and Belgium, archaeologists have uncovered dozens of Merovingian graves, from kings to nobles to common warriors. What they reveal is a society steeped in ritual, blending Christian faith with older traditions. Warriors were buried with swords, shields, and horses, echoes of pagan belief in an afterlife of battle. Women were buried with brooches, jewelry, and amulets, some Christian, some older charms. The artistry of these objects is striking. Gold and garnet inlays shimmer in Merovingian weapons, their designs intricate, their symbolism often obscure. Brooches shaped like animals hint at pagan motifs: wolves, birds, serpents. Crosses appear, but alongside symbols whose meaning eludes us. It is as though the dynasty lived at a crossroads of symbols, unwilling or unable to sever old ties even as new ones bound them. Particularly intriguing are burials where relics of saints appear. Some Merovingian graves contain crosses or reliquaries, suggesting kings and queens were interred as guardians of the sacred. This mingling of royal blood and holy relic points to a fusion, the dynasty itself as living relic, a bloodline entwined with sanctity. Texts and chronicles. Archaeology gives us objects, texts give us words, but the Merovingians are strange here too, for the words that survive often speak as much in silence as in detail. The most important chronicler of the Merovingians was Gregory of Tours, writing in the 6th century. His History of the Franks remains our window into the dynasty's world, yet Gregory writes with an ambivalence that is hard to ignore. At times, he praises Clovis and his descendants, casting them as instruments of God's will. At other times, he records their violence, their betrayals, their sins, with barely concealed unease. His tone is both reverent and suspicious, as if he recognized in the Merovingians something beyond his comfort. Other chronicles, like the Liber Historia Francorum, written in the 8th century, treat the dynasty with increasing dismissal. By then, the Carolingians were rising, and the Merovingians were recast as weak, idle kings. But even in dismissal, the chroniclers cannot erase the aura. They speak of long hair, of strange taboos, of kings who seemed more relic than ruler. Their very attempt to reduce them reveals the persistence of mystery. Manstia. Legal texts also survive, most notably the Lex Salica, the Salic law, codified under Clovis. Though a legal document, it too hums with strangeness, for it blends Roman formality with tribal custom, Christian morality with pagan echoes. In its clauses, one senses the dynasty's role as bridge between empire and tribe, faith and myth, past and future. The gaps in the record. Perhaps the most haunting discovery is not what survives, but what does not. For whole swaths of Merovingian history are silent, missing, or blurred. Chronicles grow vague. Records fragment. Names vanish. Was this neglect the result of poor record keeping in an age of instability? Or was it deliberate? Did later scribes, eager to glorify the Carolingians, cut away what was inconvenient? Silence itself becomes an artifact. Each gap is a clue, for in what is not said, in what is not preserved, one hears the echo of suppression, interpretations of the finds. What, then, do these discoveries tell us? At one level, they confirm that the Merovingians were kings of real wealth and power, not mere shadows. Their tombs, their treasures, their laws show authority and influence. At another level, they reveal a dynasty living at the edge of two worlds, Christian and pagan, Roman and tribal, sacred and secular. But at the deepest level, the discoveries do not explain, they deepen the mystery. Bees that vanish in theft, hair that embodies kingship, tombs that mix crosses with older charms, chronicles that speak in half tones, silences that seem deliberate. The Merovingians resist clarity, as if their very legacy was designed to linger in twilight. A modern excavation. Imagine standing at the edge of Childeric's tomb in 1653 as the first golden bee is lifted into light. The air is thick with earth, the glimmer of gold dazzling in the lamplight. Scholars gather, whispering theories, unable to explain, or picture yourself in the crypt of Saint Denis, tracing your hand over Dagobert's stone coffin, the coldness of the marble seeping into your skin. You feel not certainty, but presence. The discoveries remind us that history is never only fact, it is symbol, aura, silence. The Merovingians endure not because of what we know, but because of what we do not. Archaeology has given us fragments, but the fragments point to something larger, concealed, unfinished. Thus, the material remains, and the written records alike refuse to give us closure. Instead, they invite us deeper into the mystery. The Merovingians left behind enough to tantalize, but never enough to resolve. Their legacy is not certainty, but haunting. And so, we step forward from the past into the present, carrying these bees, these bones, these silences, for the Merovingian mystery is not confined to the ruins. It lives still, in the way we imagine them, in the way their symbols resurface, in the whispers that echo even now. The next stage of our journey must ask, how do these echoes connect to our world today? Where do the Merovingians still touch us through myth, through culture, through conspiracy, through symbol? What is their connection to the present? Connection to the present. The Merovingians may have vanished from thrones more than a millennium ago, but they have not vanished from imagination. Their legacy lingers not as a line of rulers neatly tucked into textbooks, but as a pulse beneath the skin of Europe, a whisper that rises in folklore, in scholarship, in esoteric speculation, and even in the ambitions of modern politics. They belong to that strange category of historical presences that refuse to die. Instead, they echo, resurfacing in unexpected ways, connecting past to present as if their mystery itself were alive. The French landscape of memory. Walk through France today, and you find the Merovingians in subtle places, half buried yet persistent. Towns like Soissons, Metz, and Tournai still carry traces of their kings. Churches like Saint Denis, where Dagobert lies, still hold their bones. The Salic law, born in their courts, shaped European inheritance traditions for centuries, influencing everything from royal succession to property rights. In Paris, beneath the shadow of Gothic spires and Haussmann boulevards, Merovingian roots remain. Saint Denis, once their sacred burial site, became the necropolis of France. Tourists walk its aisles to see the marble effigies of Capetians and Bourbons, scarcely noticing the older tombs quieter, humbler, but no less powerful. Yet for those who pause, the names Dagobert, Clothar, Clovis resonate. In those names lies the foundation of the very kingdom that would one day become France. Their bloodline, though dethroned, seeded the nobility of Europe. Intermarriage ensured that echoes of Merovingian ancestry wound their way into later dynasties. Though the Carolingians claimed to replace them, they did not erase them. Their blood flowed quietly, not in crowns but in veins, whispering in genealogies traced by scholars and enthusiasts alike. The political appropriation of memory. In modern times, even political figures have reached back to the Merovingians. Napoleon, as noted, revived the symbol of the bee, adorning his coronation robes with the swarm first buried with Childeric. He understood, instinctively or strategically, that the Merovingians represented something more ancient and primal than the fleur-de-lis of medieval kings. By linking himself to their golden bees, Napoleon sought to claim an inheritance not merely of France, but of mystery itself. Others, too, have glanced toward the Merovingians when speaking of French identity. For if Clovis was the first king to unite Gaul under Christianity, then the Merovingians stand as the dawn of France. School children may not learn their names as readily as those of Charlemagne or Louis XIV, yet in the roots of French national consciousness, the Merovingians are present. Their aura, though wrapped in legend, is part of the story of the land. The esoteric and secret societies. Perhaps the most vibrant connection to the present lies not in official memory, but in esoteric traditions. For centuries, secret societies have whispered of the Merovingians as guardians of hidden knowledge. Theories abound that they preserved ancient Gnostic wisdom, that they guarded relics suppressed by the church, that they were custodians of the Grail, whether chalice or bloodline. The Priory of Sion, though later revealed as a fabrication, captured the imagination of millions by claiming to protect the Merovingian legacy. Its mythology, however invented, struck a chord precisely because the dynasty itself invites such invention. The aura of secrecy around their fall makes them fertile ground for conspiracy. In their silence, people hear whispers. In their disappearance, people see concealment. The Merovingians are also invoked in esoteric Christianity, where some groups see them as vessels of a spiritual inheritance unbroken from Christ through Magdalene. In occult circles, their sea-born myth and bee symbolism are reinterpreted as signs of ancient wisdom, the sea as womb of mystery, the bee as symbol of immortality and divine order. Thus, the dynasty lives on in rituals, in theories, in secret gatherings, where their name is spoken as one speaks of sacred things, half in reverence, half in defiance. Popular culture. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen the Merovingians woven into novels, films, and art. The book Holy Blood, Holy Grail gave them a central place in the story of a suppressed sacred bloodline, sparking debates and controversies. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code carried those whispers into mainstream culture, embedding the Merovingians into the popular imagination as heirs of Christ. Even in more subtle forms, their presence lingers. The very name Merovingian appears in modern fantasy and science fiction, often as shorthand for mystery, for ancient power, for something half forgotten and dangerous. In The Matrix Reloaded, a character named the Merovingian embodies this archetype, suave, enigmatic, connected to forces older than the visible world. The reference is no accident. It is an acknowledgement that the word itself has become a symbol of concealed knowledge. The symbolic resonance of their myths. What gives the Merovingians such enduring presence is not only history, but symbol. Their bees resonate as symbols of immortality. Their long hair resonates as a symbol of sacred kingship. Their sea-born myth resonates as a symbol of hybrid inheritance, of the union of human and otherworldly. These symbols connect to the present because they speak to perennial human longings: the longing to believe that blood can carry holiness, the longing to believe that secrets survive suppression, the longing to believe that beneath the surface of official history lies another story, one that explains what we sense but cannot name. Thus, to speak of the Merovingians today is not merely to recall kings of early medieval Gaul, it is to enter into conversation with our own hunger for mystery. They are a mirror for our imagination, reflecting our suspicion that what we see is never the whole truth. The subconscious legacy. Perhaps the strangest connection to the present is the way the Merovingians haunt Europe's subconscious in the French landscape. Their names linger. In legal traditions, their laws echo. In symbols like the bee, their presence flutters. But beyond all that, they linger in silence, in the gaps of history, in the questions that refuse to close. For what is the true connection between past and present, if not the persistence of questions? The Merovingians connect to us not through certainty, but through ambiguity. Their very disappearance draws us in. Their silence invites speculation. Their absence feels like presence, precisely because it resists explanation. A living mystery. Imagine yourself standing today in the crypt of Saint Denis. Around you are the marble effigies of later kings, each one grand, certain, secure in its place in history. And then, in a quieter corner, the Merovingians. Their stones are humbler, their names less known, and yet as you stand there, you feel a peculiar weight. It is not grandeur, but mystery that presses upon you, the sense that these kings carry something still unsaid. Or imagine walking in the countryside near Tournai, where Childeric's tomb was found, the fields stretched quiet, the earth heavy with centuries. You know that beneath your feet, bees once swarmed in gold around a forgotten king. The gold is gone, melted, lost, but the memory remains, humming in the soil. You feel it. Even now, a connection between past and present, between mystery and imagination. The Merovingians do not live in thrones anymore, nor in armies, nor in law. They live in whispers, in symbols, in the imagination of those who sense that history hides as much as it reveals. Their connection to the present is precisely this: that they remind us of the power of mystery, of the way silence endures, of the way questions outlive answers. Thus, the Merovingians remain with us, not as rulers, but as echoes. They are the bees humming in Napoleon's robes. They are the sea-born myth, invoked in esoteric circles. They are the bloodline, whispered in novels and conspiracies. They are the hum in the stones of Saint Denis, the shimmer in the soil of Tournai. They are a dynasty not of thrones, but of imagination. And so, as we walk through their lingering presence, we arrive at the heart of their story, the questions themselves. What was concealed? Why were they erased? What lingers in their blood, their symbols, their myths that makes them unforgettable? To step deeper into the Merovingian mystery now is to face the open questions, the lingering echoes that still haunt us, unanswered, unresolved, still whispering across centuries, open questions and lingering echoes. The Merovingians are not simply remembered, they are half remembered. Their history survives not in clear lines, but in blurred edges, in fragments that refuse to settle. For every fact we hold about them, there seems to be a silence that unsettles it. For every chronicle, an omission; for every tomb, a theft. The dynasty lingers, then not as a resolved story, but as an unfinished one, humming with questions that echo across the centuries. To explore these questions is to stand in twilight. We are not in the realm of certainty, but of whisper, where the absence of evidence becomes evidence itself. The Merovingians resist closure, and this resistance is what gives them their haunting power. The mystery of origins. The first and perhaps deepest question is that of their origin. Who truly was Merovec, the semi-mythical ancestor who gave his name to the dynasty? The legend of his conception, his mother's encounter with a sea creature, half man, half beast, refuses to be read as mere fairy tale. Why would a dynasty that sought legitimacy invent such a strange story? Why not claim Trojan ancestry? Like the Romans or biblical descent, like so many medieval kings, why choose the sea, the beast, the hybrid? Was it a deliberate statement that they were not like other kings, that their bloodline was set apart, or was it a fragment of an older mythos preserved accidentally, hinting at beliefs long buried in the soil of Gaul? The sea, in ancient lore, was the threshold of mystery, a place where gods dwelt, where monsters swam, where the boundary between human and divine dissolved. By rooting their bloodline in the sea, did the Merovingians signal that they were heirs of something older than Christianity? Older even than Rome? This question has never been answered, only speculated upon. The silence around it is as telling as the legend itself. The bees of Childeric. Next comes the swarm. Childeric's tomb, with its 300 golden bees, remains one of the strangest royal burials in Europe. Why bees? Why so many? And why? Centuries later, did Napoleon resurrect them, bypassing the fleur-de-lis in favor of the ancient swarm? Were the bees merely decoration, or were they a symbol of the dynasty's secret identity? In Egypt, bees were sacred to the soul. In Greece, priestesses of Delphi were called bees. In Christian thought, bees represented resurrection, eternal life. Did the Merovingians bury themselves with bees because they believed their bloodline was immortal, their kingship indestructible? Or did they see themselves as guardians of a secret order, humming in silence like a hive hidden within history? The theft of most of the bees in the 17th century only deepens the enigma. Why should the most mysterious emblem of the dynasty vanish, melted into nothingness? Was it coincidence, or was it part of the long process of erasure that haunts the Merovingians? We will never know. But the question lingers, humming like the bees themselves. The sanctity of hair. Another echo lies in the hair of the kings. To cut it was to dethrone them, to exile them from destiny. Why hair historians explain it as Germanic custom, yet the taboo carried an intensity beyond mere tradition. Chroniclers record with awe that a Merovingian shorn of his hair ceased to be a king, not diminished, erased. Did the hair symbolize a conduit of divine power, as in the story of Samson? Was it a physical embodiment of their seaborn lineage, a marker that their bodies themselves carried the aura of rule? And why was the act of cutting irreversible, as if no regrowth could restore it, unless the act itself was ritual, a severing of something invisible, a sacrament of destruction? The silence of sources on why the hair mattered only deepens the enigma. The taboo itself is the clue. The church's unease. Another open question is the church's strange relationship with the Merovingians. On one hand, Clovis's baptism was hailed as a new Constantine moment, a triumph for Christianity in Gaul. Bishops blessed Merovingian kings. Monasteries flourished under their patronage. Yet by the 8th century, the church had turned against them, blessing the deposition of Childeric and the rise of the Carolingians. Why this shift? Was it purely pragmatic, preferring the vigor of Carolingian mayors over the passivity of symbolic kings? Or was it deeper? Did the church fear the Merovingians' aura, their seaborn myth, their relic-laden courts, their aura of sanctity not wholly dependent on Christian authority? If the dynasty truly carried whispers of a holy bloodline or of ancient pagan kingship, then the church may have seen them not as allies but as rivals, too dangerous to leave unchallenged. The silence of papal letters on the exact reasoning for their support of Pipin is striking. We know only that they sanctioned the cutting of Childeric's hair, the ending of a dynasty. The reasons remain veiled. The vanishing of relics. A peculiar pattern surrounds Merovingian relics. They vanish. Childeric's bees, melted, chronicles, silent, tombs, robbed. Dagobert's legacy, blurred by hagiography. Even their laws, while preserved, are fragmentary, stitched together from copies. It is as though history itself conspired to scatter them. Is this mere coincidence, the accidents of time, or does the pattern suggest deliberate concealment? Some scholars believe that Carolingian propaganda systematically erased the Merovingians, reducing them to caricatures. Others whisper of something darker, that their relics held secrets, symbols too unsettling to survive, and so they were deliberately destroyed. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence, but whose absence and why? The question of bloodline. Perhaps the most enduring question is whether the Merovingian bloodline survive. Officially, the dynasty ended with Childeric III's deposition, yet whispers of descendants persist. Medieval genealogies occasionally hint at noble families tracing ancestry to the long-haired kings. Esoteric traditions insist the line survived in secrecy, interwoven into Europe's aristocracy. If true, then the Merovingians did not vanish. They went underground. Their crowns were cut, but their blood still flows, waiting. This possibility fuels theories of holy bloodlines, of the Grail as lineage, of conspiracies to protect or suppress descendants. Do Merovingian heirs walk among us? Still, historians dismiss it as legend, yet the persistence of the question itself is telling, for even in skepticism, the allure remains. The silence of historians. Perhaps the strangest echo is the tone of history itself. From Gregory of Tours to Carolingian chroniclers, the Merovingians are written about with unease, with hesitation. They are not condemned outright, nor are they fully praised. They are depicted as violent yet holy, passive yet untouchable. Even the phrase "do nothing kings" feels like a deflection, a refusal to speak plainly. What if this tone itself is the clue? What if the chroniclers knew something they could not write? What if their evasions are the faint outlines of a truth too dangerous for parchment? The lingering echo. The Merovingians remain unfinished, their origin unexplained, their symbols unresolved, their disappearance suspicious, their relics vanishing, their bloodline perhaps surviving. They are not a closed chapter, but an open question, and this openness is their legacy. For what connects them most to us today is not what we know, but what we do not know. Their presence lingers precisely because it resists closure. They are a dynasty of echoes, bees humming in absence, hair shimmering in silence, tombs whispering in loss. Imagine now walking through an ancient forest in France at dusk. The air is damp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. You come upon a moss-covered stone, its carvings worn to near oblivion. You trace your hand across it, uncertain if it once marked a grave or a boundary. The silence presses in, and in that silence you hear it, the faint hum of bees, the whisper of waves, the echo of long hair brushing across shoulders. It is not memory, but presence. The Merovingians are still here, lingering in the silence of the land itself. Thus we arrive at the heart of the mystery. The Merovingians endure not because of what history preserves, but because of what it withholds. Their power lies not in answers, but in questions, questions that refuse to die, questions that echo still. The next step is to turn from questions to places, from whispers to landscapes. For if the Merovingians linger, they do so not only in books and bloodlines, but in the enchanted geography of Europe itself, forests, rivers, ruins where their memory still breathes, enchanted landscapes. If history forgets, the land remembers. Where ink fades, where chronicles fall silent, the forests, rivers, and ruins of Europe still hold their whispers. The Merovingians may have vanished from royal thrones, their bloodlines severed from crowns, yet the earth itself, patient, untamed, older than kings, retains the echo of their presence. To trace them now is not only to read parchment, but to walk slowly, to listen to wind and water, to touch stone and moss, where their memory lingers. The forest of Gaul. Imagine yourself in the forests that once covered vast stretches of Gaul. Oaks rise like pillars, their roots tangling with ancient shrines half swallowed by soil. Pines murmur in the wind, and mist drapes the ground like a veil. These were not simply woodlands, but sacred groves where druids had spoken to the unseen long before the cross crowned Europe. Even after Christianity spread, villagers still whispered of the spirits of trees, of voices in the leaves. It was in these forests that Merovingian kings are said to have retreated, not merely to hunt, but to commune. Chroniclers hint, though never fully explain, that the kings drew a power from solitude in these groves, a right of kingship bound not to palace walls, but to the very living earth. Clovis may have been baptized in Reims, but his roots were in the woods, long-haired, wild, Untamed by Rome, the Merovingians carried the aura of the forest itself, as though their blood was threaded with the sap of ancient trees. Stand still in one of these groves today, in the Ardennes or deep in Burgundy, and you may feel it a hush, a weight, and as though the air itself remembers that once kings stood here with crowns invisible, drawn not from papal blessing, but from the whisper of leaves. The rivers of power. The Merovingians were not mountain kings, they were river kings. Their dynasty rose along the waterways of Gaul the Seine, the Loire, the Meuse, the Rhine. Rivers were their roads, their arteries, their lifeblood. But rivers are more than geography. In myth, they are thresholds. To cross a river is to move between worlds. To bathe in one is to be renewed. The chroniclers tell us little of rituals, but legends linger that Merovingian kings were marked not only by long hair, but by baptism, not just in holy fonts, but in running waters, where river and blood intertwined. Think of Soissons, of Paris, of Tournai, each a river city, each a place where the dynasty anchored its power. When Clovis waged war, it was often by riversides. When his heirs built churches, they rose by flowing water. The bee of Childeric, perhaps, was not only a symbol of the soul, but of the hive that follows the river, finding sweetness where waters nourish. To walk today along the Marne at dusk, when mist curls low and the river glimmers silver, is to sense the continuity of this memory. The rivers of Gaul still murmur with the passage of boats, but beneath that sound, deeper, older, is another murmur of coronations, of battles, of whispered prayers over flowing water, sacred springs and hidden wells. Beyond the grand rivers were smaller, stranger waters, spring wells, and fountains said to carry healing or prophecy. Many of these were claimed by saints in later centuries, yet their legends run deeper, back to the time when water itself was sacred. The Merovingians were tied to such places. Some chronicles describe their queens as priestesses of springs, women whose very presence sanctified the waters. Batilda, Dagobert's queen, was remembered not only as a ruler, but as one who sanctified wells, making them holy. Did this memory survive because it was Christianized, or does it hint at something older, where queens were keepers of waters, guardians of hidden wells? Stand beside such a spring now, perhaps, in the rolling hills of Burgundy, where a mossy fountain still flows into a stone basin, and you will hear more than water. You will hear the echo of footsteps, of cloaked figures who once leaned down to drink, believing that in this water lay destiny itself. Ruins and stones. The Merovingians built, but they also inherited across Gaul. Roman ruins still stood in their day amphitheaters, temples, baths, had bridges. To walk among them was to walk among ghosts of an empire fallen, stone arches rising into silence. The Merovingians often claimed these ruins, transforming them into palaces, churches, or fortresses. Yet some ruins they left untouched. Why did they sense in certain stones a presence too old, too heavy to claim, or did they, like their subjects, believe these places still belonged to gods who had not wholly departed? One ruin, the Basilica of Saint Denis near Paris, became the resting place of kings. Dagobert himself was buried there, though the abbey grew later under Carolingians and Capetians. To stand there today, beneath Gothic vaults, is to sense that something older than the Gothic, older even than Christianity, lies beneath the memory of Merovingian kings, their bones laid where Roman, Gaul, and myth intersected. And then there are stones more obscure menhirs, dolmens, standing stones scattered across the countryside, relics of prehistory. So did Merovingian kings feel kinship with these chroniclers are silent, but peasants whispered of kings visiting stones at night, seeking counsel from the earth itself. The silence of the texts may itself be telling. Enchanted cities? Certain cities pulse with Merovingian memory. Reims, where Clovis was baptized in holy oil, still hums with the resonance of that moment. Paris, where Dagobert ruled, carries beneath its Gothic grandeur the faint echo of a Frankish court lit by torches. Soissons, where Clovis struck down a rival for a sacred vase, retains the aura of that first mingling of violence and sanctity. These cities are layered places where Roman roads, Frankish palaces, and medieval cathedrals overlap like palimpsests. To walk their streets at twilight is to feel the strata of time, one footstep Roman, the next Merovingian, the next medieval. But perhaps the most enchanted are not the cities that thrived, but the towns that faded. Tournai, once Childeric's seat, is quieter now, its name less known, yet its soil holds tombs, its air hums with lost majesty. To walk Tournai by night is to feel the ghost of a dynasty that flickered and was forgotten, yet never fully erased. The quiet of abbeys. The Merovingians were patrons of monasteries, and abbeys still mark their landscapes. Lixeuil, Saint Denis, Saint Germain des Prés all grew from their support. Yet in these cloisters lies not only sanctity, but secrecy. Monks preserved what kings allowed. They wrote what patrons demanded. Some abbeys hold charters, fragments, mentions of kings, yet always partial, always elusive. Walking through such abbeys today, with their cloisters bathed in shadow, you sense more than the prayers of monks. You sense the weight of erasure, of memories edited and rewritten. These abbeys are not only places of devotion, but of silence, silence heavy with what was left unwritten, the landscape as memory. Perhaps the most haunting thing is this, that the Merovingians live less in chronicles than in geography. Their legacy clings to rivers, forests, ruins, wells, and abbeys. The land itself remembers. To travel through France is to follow an invisible map, a bee carved into a stone in Tournai, a spring dedicated to Bathilde in Burgundy, a forest clearing in the Ardennes, a ruined wall in Soissons. Each is a fragment, a whisper. Together they form not a complete story, but an atmosphere, a presence. This is why the Merovingians cannot be forgotten. Their memory does not depend on parchment alone. It depends on the earth, and the earth remembers. Stand, then, on a hill at dusk, overlooking a river that curves like silver through the fields. The sun dips low, the first star rises. You hear the distant toll of a church bell, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of water. And beneath it all, you feel it, the hum of bees, the brush of unseen hair, the whisper of kings who once walked this land. The landscapes of Gaul are not merely geography. They are the enchanted stage where the Merovingian mystery still lingers, half remembered, half forgotten, fully alive in silence. The question that follows is simple yet profound. Were the Merovingians alone in this aura? Or do other legends across the world echo their strangeness? Are there parallel stories of kings whose blood, whose symbols, whose vanishing left echoes as strong? And so we turn next, not only to Gaul, but outward to parallel legends, where the Merovingian mystery finds reflection in distant dynasties, myths, and holy lineages that mirror their enigma, parallel legends. The story of the Merovingians, with its blend of sanctity, secrecy, and sudden disappearance, does not stand alone in history. Across continents and centuries, echoes can be heard other dynasties, other bloodlines, other sacred rulers whose memory lingers less in chronicles than in myth. To understand the Merovingian enigma, one must set it beside these parallels to see how the human imagination and perhaps hidden truths repeat the same haunting melody in different lands. The pharaohs of Egypt begin in Egypt, where kings were not simply rulers, but gods incarnate. The pharaoh was Horus on earth. His bloodline descended from the sun. His body was a vessel of divinity. His crown, not merely a symbol, but a living connection between heaven and earth. When the Merovingians were whispered to be divine kings, when their hair was said to hold power, can we not hear the distant echo of the Egyptian ruler whose body was sacred, whose very flesh carried cosmic weight? The pyramids stand as stone embodiments of this belief. They were tombs, yes, but also conduits, bridges between worlds. One cannot help but imagine, did the Merovingians inherit a fragment of this ancient archetype, passed through centuries of myth, reshaped in the forests of Gaul? Both dynasties seemed bound to sacred animals as well. The bee of Childeric, the bee of Neith, goddess of Lower Egypt, both symbols of immortality, of resurrection, of the soul's journey. The parallel is not proof, but resonance. The Davidic line. Turn, then, to the Near East. In the Hebrew scriptures, the line of King David was said to be eternal, chosen by God, destined never to be extinguished. Later traditions whispered that even if earthly thrones fell, the bloodline endured, hidden, awaiting its return. Is it coincidence that the Merovingians, centuries later, were rumored by some to be custodians of a hidden holy bloodline, one tied, perhaps, to Christ himself, or to the Davidic kings? The chronicles are silent, but legends rush in to fill the silenced tales of queens descending from sacred unions, of heirs who carried not only royal blood, but something more, something dangerous to reveal. The motif is striking a dynasty suddenly cut down, yet rumors insist the blood survives, hidden, waiting. The Merovingians may have lost their thrones, but their myth lives on precisely because it mirrors this archetype, the chosen bloodline, concealed, enduring, haunting history like a shadow. The Lost Kings of Ireland. Across the sea in Ireland, ancient kingship was bound to the land itself. The king was not only ruler, but consort of the goddess of the soil. His right to rule depended on a sacred marriage to the land, ritually renewed. If he failed in his duty, if famine struck, if justice faltered, the land itself withered, and his kingship could be revoked. In these echoes, the Merovingians are reflected. Their right to rule was tied to the visible sign of their haircutted, and the bond was broken. Just as an Irish king could be stripped of kingship if he failed the sacred covenant, both traditions hint at something older than Christianity, or Rome, a kingship that was not political alone, but mystical, woven into the very cycles of nature. And just as Ireland's kings were sometimes remembered as half divine, their origins tangled with goddesses or druids, so too were the Merovingians rumored to descend from a sea creature, a water spirit, or a goddess like figure whose union with a Frankish leader birthed their line. A strange myth, perhaps, but one that fits neatly into this larger global pattern kingship as something otherworldly, sanctioned not by councils or treaties, but by mysteries of the earth and sky. The dragon-blooded emperors of China. Far to the east, Chinese emperors were called the sons of heaven. Their rule was legitimate only so long as they possessed the mandate of heaven, a concept as elusive as it was absolute. Dynasties rose and fell according to omens, comets, floods, famines. The ruler's body was sacred, his bloodline tied to dragons, those shimmering symbols of cosmic power. Does this not recall the Merovingian mystique, where kings were not merely political figures, but bearers of sacred blood? The parallel is striking: long hair as a sign of divine aura in Gaul, dragons as emblems of celestial legitimacy in China. In both traditions, when omens soured, the dynasty fell not only politically, but cosmically. And yet, even after the fall, the myth endured. In China, the imperial dragon bloodline was said never to vanish completely, always to reappear in another branch. In the Merovingian legend, too, whispers continued that their bloodline survived, hidden, never extinguished. The sacred blood of the Incas. Cross oceans and centuries and arrive in the high Andes. The Inca emperors of Peru were believed to descend from the sun god Inti. Their blood was sacred. Their sisters became their queens to keep the lineage pure. When the Spanish arrived, they cut down the empire, executed its ruler, and tried to erase its memory. Yet even after the last emperor was killed, whispers persisted that a hidden Inca king would return, rising from obscurity to reclaim the land. The resonance with the Merovingians is unmistakable. Both dynasties were tied to solar imagery. Both claimed semi-divine descent. Both were crushed by rivals who sought to erase them. Yet in both cases, the people continued to whisper the blood lives on, hidden, waiting. The Arthurian echo. And then, closer to Gaul, the Arthurian legend emerges. King Arthur, perhaps historical, perhaps mythical, was said to be the once and future king. He fell, but did not die. He waits in Avalon to return when his people most need him. The Merovingians, too, are sometimes cast in this mold, not as individuals who will return, but as a bloodline waiting in obscurity, ready to reemerge when the time is right. Arthur, the hidden king, the Merovingians, the hidden line, both are sustained by the same archetype that power can be buried, but never destroyed. The pattern of sacred kingship. What do all these parallels suggest? That the Merovingians were not unique, but a part of a larger pattern of human imagination or human memory? Across cultures, kingship was rarely a matter of politics alone. It was something sacred, dangerous, and mysterious. To cut down such a dynasty was never enough. Stories arose to protect them, to preserve them, to whisper that the blood lived on. Perhaps it is human longing, the desire to believe that true power never dies. Or perhaps it is more, perhaps beneath the surface of myth lies a hidden truth, a lineage so ancient and so enduring that it appears in different guises across the world. Returning to Gaul, when we return, then to the Merovingians, we see them not in isolation, but as part of this universal chorus. Their long hair, their bees, their sudden disappearance, all these find echoes in pharaohs, in emperors, in high kings, and lost rulers across time. Stand again in a forest clearing in France and imagine, is the silence here only silence, or is it filled with these echoes? The Merovingians are gone, yet their story is part of something older and wider, a human dream of sacred blood and hidden kingship that repeats itself like a refrain across continents. The question that follows is haunting. If so many cultures whisper the same story, is it only myth, or is it perhaps memory? And so we move onward to Return of the Trace, where we will follow the strange reappearances of the Merovingian mystery in later centuries, clues in unexpected places, names that resurface, symbols that refuse to fade, the bloodline that may not have vanished after all. Return of the Trace. When a dynasty vanishes, history often declares its story complete. Yet with the Merovingians, the silence is deceptive. Though their crowns were stripped, their hair shorn, and their name relegated to footnotes, the traces of their presence seem to reappear like faint footprints in the sand, always half erased, yet stubbornly enduring. To follow these traces is to step into a labyrinth of whispered claims, secret societies, and symbols that reemerge centuries after their supposed extinction. The lingering bloodline. It begins with a rumor, soft but persistent, that the blood of the Merovingians did not vanish with the last dethroned king. Their descendants, so the story goes, did not die out but slipped into obscurity, intermarrying with noble families across Europe. Some chronicles, especially those written long after their fall, hint at marriages between surviving Merovingian princesses and regional lords. If so, their blood may have flowed silently through generations, diluted yet never extinguished. In certain regions of southern France, Aquitaine, Septimania, and Provence, local families were said to carry a mysterious inheritance. Was it coincidence that some of these lands would later be associated with heretical movements, with whispers of hidden knowledge, with guardians of forbidden truths? Perhaps, or perhaps the bloodline carried not only ancestry, but also an aura of dangerous memory, one that drew both reverence and suspicion. The Carolingian shadow. The dynasty that replaced the Merovingians, the Carolingians, seemed determined to bury their predecessors' memory. Yet the more thoroughly they tried, the more curious details slipped through. Even Pepin the Short, who deposed the last Merovingian king, felt compelled to seek papal blessing to legitimize his rule, as though divine sanction were required to overcome the aura of sacred kingship that still clung to the long-haired kings. The Carolingians' chroniclers painted the Merovingians as weak, idle, fainéants, do-nothing kings. But was this merely propaganda, a shadow thrown across their memory to justify their erasure? Such exaggerations suggest unease, as though the Merovingian mystique could not be destroyed outright, but had to be covered, masked, rewritten. Yet beneath that mask, the trace endures. The very effort to obscure them reveals how deeply their memory haunted the new rulers. Like ink that refuses to fade, their presence lingered, ghostly, beneath the Carolingian script. The Templars and the south of France. Centuries later, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the Knights Templar rose to prominence. Their presence in the Languedoc, in the very regions once linked to Merovingian lore, has long fed speculation. The Templars were guardians of secrets, custodians of hidden relics. They, too, were accused of heresy, of secret rites, of mysteries too dangerous for the Church to tolerate. Some modern theories, however speculative, suggest that the Templars may have inherited fragments of the Merovingian mystery documents, relics, or even genealogical knowledge. After all, both the Templars and the Merovingians are tied, in legend, to the same landscapes of southern France, places like Rennes-le-Château, where myths of buried treasure and sacred bloodlines thrive. Was there truly a hidden continuity, or is it simply that the land itself, rich with memory, attracts layer upon layer of legend? The Templars fell, but their aura, like that of the Merovingians, refused to vanish. The bees that reappeared. One of the strangest traces is found in the Napoleonic era. When Napoleon Bonaparte sought to create symbols for his new empire, he rejected the fleur-de-lis, emblem of the Capetian kings, and instead chose golden bees. These bees, unearthed from the tomb of Childeric, the Merovingian king, were said to symbolize immortality and resurrection. Why did Napoleon, centuries later, resurrect this forgotten emblem? Was it simply an archaeological curiosity or a deliberate gesture, aligning himself with the aura of the first royal dynasty of France by clothing his empire with Merovingian bees? Napoleon awakened a symbol that had lain dormant for over 1,000 years, reattaching himself to a lineage long thought buried. Here, the trace is not subtle, but blazing the bee, small yet potent, hovering like a living relic of Merovingian sovereignty. The Holy Grail connection. No discussion of Merovingian traces is complete without the most sensational, their alleged connection to the legend of the Holy Grail. Popularized in modern times, this theory suggests that the Grail was never a cup, but a bloodline, the sang royal, or royal blood. In this reading, the Merovingians were custodians of a sacred inheritance, perhaps even a direct descent from Christ himself through Mary Magdalene. The historical basis for this is tenuous, more rooted in modern myth-making than medieval sources, yet the very persistence of the idea is telling. Why, among all dynasties, is it the Merovingians who are imagined as carriers of such a burden? Something in their legend invites this speculation. Their mystique, their sudden fall, their aura of sanctity all make them fertile ground for such myths to take root. Even if the theory is no more than a modern invention, it is itself a trace, a sign that the Merovingians, unlike other forgotten dynasties, refuse to stay buried. Their name continues to attract mystery, like a magnet drawing iron filings across centuries. Secret societies and the Renaissance whisper. During the Renaissance and later, whispers of secret societies emerged, groups like the Rosicrucians, who claimed to guard hidden wisdom. Later still, the infamous Priory of Sion was said to exist, a brotherhood sworn to protect the Merovingian bloodline. Though the Priory has been largely revealed as a modern fabrication, its resonance speaks to something deeper, the readiness of the imagination to connect the Merovingians to hidden currents of history. Why do secret societies so often gravitate toward this dynasty? Perhaps because their very obscurity leaves fertile ground for invention. A dynasty erased leaves a void, and voids draw stories. But perhaps, too, there were indeed fragments preserved documents, relics, whispers that fueled centuries of quiet speculation. The silent villages. Travel through southern France today, and you will find quiet villages where legends of hidden treasure, sacred relics, or lost dynasties are still told. In Rennes-le-Château, in particular, myths swirl of a priest who discovered something so dangerous, so valuable, that he became inexplicably wealthy. Some claim he unearthed documents proving the survival of the Merovingian bloodline. Others suggest he found the treasure of the Templars. No one knows the truth, but the persistence of these stories in one small village shows how powerfully the Merovingian name still reverberates. Even in whispers, even in folk tales, the trace continues. The archetypal return. Perhaps the most profound trace is not in artifacts or genealogy, but in the human psyche. Again and again, the archetype of the hidden king, the sacred bloodline, the dynasty that endures in secret, returns in different guises. The Merovingians are one face of this recurring archetype. Their story, whether factual or embellished, taps into a timeless human longing that true sovereignty cannot be destroyed, that somewhere, hidden, the sacred blood endures. Like Arthur in Avalon, like the Inca king awaiting his return, the Merovingians linger not only in history, but in imagination. Their trace is not confined to tombs or parchments, it moves within the deeper soil of myth. The breath of continuity. And so, from bees to bloodlines, From villages to secret societies, from Napoleon to modern conspiracy theories, the Merovingians continue to return, not as kings and palaces, but as shadows and stories, as symbols reawakened, as mysteries that refuse to sleep. Their dynasty was broken. Yes, but their trace is unbroken. It moves quietly through the centuries, subtle but insistent, waiting to be noticed. Perhaps this is the true legacy of the Merovingians, not power wielded in their own time, but a mystery that lingers across all time, forever unsettling the silence of history. The path now draws us closer to the final veil, to the last breath of the mystery, where we will ask what it means for a dynasty to vanish yet endure, and what secrets may yet remain unspoken in the breath between memory and silence. Last breath of the mystery. The story of the Merovingians is like a candle that flickers in a long forgotten chamber, its flame rising, falling, nearly extinguished, yet never quite snuffed out. In this twilight, one begins to wonder what remains when the line of kings is cut, when the chronicles are rewritten, when the symbols are scattered. Perhaps it is not merely history we are dealing with, but a kind of haunting, a presence that does not vanish even when silenced. The Merovingians do not stand before us in flesh, yet their shadow, their mystery, their breath lingers across centuries like incense that never fully disperses. The silence that speaks. When the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was forced into a monastery and his hair shorn, it seemed to mark the definitive end of the dynasty, yet the records from that time fall curiously silent, as if eager not only to close the chapter, but to lock the book. The Carolingians, who replaced them, wrote of them with scorn, calling them lazy kings, puppets unfit to rule. But when one listens carefully, that scorn sounds like overcompensation, the voice of power trying to silence a rival that still threatened from beyond the grave. It is in this silence, these gaps, these half erased pages, that the last breath of the Merovingians can still be heard, a breath that whispers, "We were more than kings of earth. We were something other, something woven into myth itself." The myth of the long hair. Their long hair was no mere fashion. Chroniclers insisted that to cut a Merovingian's hair was to rob him of kingship, as though sovereignty were bound to the very strands that fell from his head. The last recorded act of the dynasty was this ritual, cutting a gesture that was not merely political, but deeply symbolic, a severing of more than lineage. But what if the hair was not simply a custom, but a symbol of continuity, a living relic of something ancient? Some see echoes of Samson, whose strength lay in his locks. Others find parallels with the Germanic priest kings, whose sacredness was bound to their untouched hair. If this were so, then the cutting of Childeric's hair was not just an end, but a ritual execution of a sacred inheritance. The last breath of the mystery may lie in that very act, an attempt to extinguish not just a man, but a current of myth flowing through blood and bone. The hidden tombs. The tomb of Childeric, discovered in Tournai in the 17th century, yielded treasures unlike any other golden bees, signet rings, swords inlaid with garnet, and a horse buried beside its master. To some, these were the relics of a barbarian king. To others, they were emblems of a dynasty whose rule was cloaked in the sacred. But what became of the other tombs, the other kings and queens of the line? Many were lost, their locations unmarked, their contents perhaps still sealed beneath soil and stone. Were they destroyed deliberately, their relics hidden away to erase the memory of a dynasty, too unsettling to the narrative of power? Or do they still wait, silent, in the earth-sealed chambers whose opening might breathe new life into old mysteries? Each lost tomb is like a pause in history, a place where silence itself becomes a clue. The Merovingians may have vanished from chronicles, but beneath the soil, their breath still lingers, waiting for discovery. The Queen's Whisper. Among the Merovingians, the women often stand like shadows behind the kings, yet their presence is strangely powerful. Queens such as Fredegund and Brunhild, remembered for cunning and cruelty, also seem larger than life, as though they carried the mantle of ancient priestesses. Their names echo faintly against the backdrop of older myths, echoes of goddesses of fertility, war, and fate. It is tempting to wonder if the queens themselves were the true carriers of the bloodline, the vessels of continuity when kings fell to battle or betrayal. Some traditions suggest that the sacredness of the dynasty lay not only in its male heirs, but in its union with a feminine line of immense power, one perhaps linked to older pre Christian traditions. If this were so, then the last breath of the Merovingians may not lie in kings' tombs, but in the forgotten genealogies of queens whose stories were deliberately obscured. Even now, in whispers of bloodlines continuing in secret, one often finds the trace of a woman, unnamed, unnamed again, yet carrying something forward. The veil of Christendom. The Merovingians ruled during a time when Christianity was still young in the West, still struggling against the persistence of older gods and rites. They were the dynasty that oversaw the fusion of Frankish custom with the new faith. But what if their inheritance was too complex, too ambiguous, neither wholly pagan nor wholly Christian, but a troubling mixture of both? If so, then the church may have found their memory inconvenient. To sanctify them fully was impossible. To condemn them outright was dangerous. Better, perhaps, to let them fade, to allow the Carolingians and then the Capetians to reframe history as a clear triumph of Christian kingship. Yet in art, in relics, in half remembered symbols, the Merovingian breath persists. Bees, serpents, strange sigils carved in churches, each may carry a trace of something older, something that slipped beneath the surface when official memory closed the book. A line that refuses to die. It is here that we meet the most enduring speculation that the bloodline of the Merovingians did not perish at all, that descendants survived, intermarried, hid themselves in plain sight, from the nobility of Aquitaine to the mysterious figures associated with the Cathars and later with the Knights Templar. The idea persists that the line did not end, but simply went underground. And so, every so often, the breath returns in whispered genealogies, in secret societies, in modern books and tales that claim to have unearthed a hidden inheritance. Each time, the story shifts, but the pattern is the same. The line endures, though unseen, like a current moving beneath the surface of history. Whether one believes these claims or not, their persistence across centuries suggests something more than fantasy. A dynasty truly forgotten would not inspire such continual resurrection. Something, somewhere, breathes still. The psychological trace. Perhaps the last breath of the Merovingians lies not in any bloodline or relic, but in the human mind itself, for their story taps into something primal, the belief that true sovereignty is more than politics, that it carries a sacred essence, a divine right, a mystical aura. The Merovingians embodied this archetype. They were not simply kings, they were chosen, long-haired, sacred. Their very fall, their erasure, only deepened their aura, transforming them into something closer to myth than history. And myths do not die. They linger in collective memory, in dreams, in the stories that generations whisper when night is deep and silence heavy. To speak of the Merovingians is to awaken that archetype, once more the hidden king, the sacred blood, the dynasty erased but unforgotten. The final breath. And so, we arrive at the final breath of the mystery. It is not a conclusion, but a pause, a silence that waits. Perhaps the Merovingians survive in blood, in relics, traits, in secret guardianship. Perhaps they survive only in story, in the imagination of those who long for a world where kings are more than men, where power flows from the sacred and the eternal. The truth may never be known, but the breath remained, soft and persistent across the centuries, a dynasty erased, but never quite gone, a whisper carried on the winds of history, asking us to listen, to wonder, to remember. And as the night deepens, one cannot help but ask if the Merovingians truly carried a secret too great to survive in the open. What would it mean if that secret were to surface again? Would we be ready to hear it? The last breath of their mystery does not close, it lingers, suspended, like the final note of a chant in an ancient cathedral. The sound fades, but the silence that follows is charged, expectant, alive. Now the chamber grows still. The air is hushed. We stand at the threshold of silence, where history ends and myth begins. What remains is not certainty, but the quiet tremor of possibility, the eternal breath of a mystery that refuses to die. The closing whisper. The night has grown long, and the tale of the Merovingians has wound its way through shadows and light like a river carrying fragments of memory across centuries. We have walked among their ruins, touched the fragments of their crowns, listened to the hush of their legends, and felt the strange silence that history has draped around them. And now, as all stories must, this one comes to its resting place, not with certainty, not with the blunt finality of fact, but with the soft drifting of a whisper. The weight of forgotten crowns. If you close your eyes, you may see it, a crown resting in the darkness, its gold dulled by centuries, its jewels dim beneath layers of earth. Once it gleamed upon the head of a king whose name has slipped from common memory. Though his blood once bound together the fate of nations, the Merovingian crown is more than an artifact. It is an idea. It carries the weight of what was lost, of what was erased, and of what was too powerful to be left unspoken. History has many such crowns, symbols that linger even when their bearers are gone, yet the Merovingian crown feels different. It is not entirely silent, it seems to hum faintly, a reminder that some lines, some truths, are not extinguished but hidden, biding their time. The veil between fact and legend. Throughout this journey, one truth has emerged more clearly than any other. The Merovingians exist in the threshold between fact and legend. They are both historical rulers of early medieval Europe and figures of myth whose aura exceeds the sparse chronicles that remain. Their long hair, their sacred aura, their strange disappearance. These are not details that belong only to the ledger of kings, but to the larger theater of myth where gods, heroes, and chosen bloodlines dwell. And it is here, in this liminal space, that the closing whisper lingers. For what is legend if not the last attempt of memory to keep alive what history has buried? The Merovingians are not the only dynasty to slip into legend, but their case is unique. They seem to resist erasure. Every attempt to close the book by Carolingians, by churchmen, by later chroniclers has left a space through which their story seeps, returning again and again like water through stone. The breath of the landscape. Walk in the valleys of northern France, where rivers move slowly under the shadows of oaks. Walk through the ruins of Tournai, or along the Seine, where Paris first began to rise in stone. In these places, if you are very quiet, you may feel the weight of something beneath your feet, not simply the soil of Europe, but the memory of kings whose presence has not departed. Landscapes remember, forests that once sheltered Merovingian hunts, rivers where their battles were fought, hills where their castles rose, they breathe with their absence. The stones themselves seem to murmur, and the air at dusk seems charged with something unspoken. Perhaps this is the true closing whisper, not a voice carried through books or relics, but the breath of the earth itself, remembering what was buried, the question that remains. And so we come to the question that cannot be dismissed. Why? Why was this dynasty so carefully silenced, so quickly forgotten, so thoroughly dismissed as idle do-nothing kings? Was it political necessity alone, or did they carry a secret, a legacy, a truth so powerful that it could not survive in daylight? Speculation abounds. Some say they held knowledge of sacred relics, some whisper of bloodlines linked to Christ himself. Others imagine ancient pagan traditions woven into their rule, too dangerous for the church to tolerate. But perhaps the truth is simpler and yet more profound. Perhaps the Merovingians embodied something humanity is both drawn to and afraid of, the idea that power is not merely political, but mystical, that kingship is not just rule, but sanctity, that in some bloodlines, some symbols, some silences, there lies a mystery too deep to be extinguished. It is this possibility, the haunting what if, that gives the Merovingian tale its enduring life, the softness of secrets. There are secrets that shout, and there are secrets that whisper. The Merovingians belong to the latter. They are not like the loud secrets of wars and scandals, which dominate chronicles and songs. Their mystery is quiet, like a candle flame in an empty chapel, like a rustle of robes behind closed doors, like a prayer spoken too softly to be overheard. And it is precisely this softness that has allowed their mystery to endure. A secret whispered can travel farther than one shouted. It seeps into imagination, it finds its way into legends, although it hides in the pauses of history. The Merovingian whisper is still here, reaching you across centuries. The listener's role. Now, in this final moment, the whisper passes to you, for mysteries live not only in the past, but in the minds that carry them forward. You, listening now, are part of the thread. By wondering, by imagining, by allowing the question to linger, you keep the Merovingian breath alive. Perhaps you will dream of the long-haired kings walking through forest mists. Perhaps you will think of queens whose names were almost erased, yet still burn faintly like stars half hidden by clouds. Perhaps you will recall the silence of old churches and wonder what crypts lie sealed beneath. And perhaps, most of all, you will remember that history is not always what it seems, that beneath the lines of dates and battles, there are shadows, whispers, secrets that resist the pen. The whisper that never ends. As the night deepens and your eyes grow heavy, let the story settle within you like falling snow. Do not seek certainty, for there is none here. The Merovingians leave us not with answers, but with a breath that drifts through the centuries, refusing to vanish. It is a whisper you may carry into your dreams that once there was a dynasty unlike any other, whose power was bound not only to swords and crowns, but to something deeper, something unspeakable, something still hidden. The last words of their story are not written in books, they are carried in silence, in the hush of the earth, in the imagination of those who dare to wonder. And so, as the candle fades and the night enfolds you, let the whisper guide you gently into rest. Listen very faintly, almost imperceptibly, you may still hear it. The Merovingians, the bloodline, the secret, the breath of a mystery that never dies.